Chapter 2066. Cher's face was cold. After a long time, she asked softly, "Are you still going to be loyal to him?" Gu Mei smiled and tilted her head to look at Cher. "He likes you. It doesn't matter who he marries. Qin Mu can't control him." Cher squinted her eyes. "You mean you'll be the third wheel when you get out?" Gu Mei raised her index finger and shushed her. "Don't show your cards too early. You've already revealed too much of your plan." "But I can understand. Zhou Chongguang and Qin Mu are together. If you marry into the Qin family, you can't watch it. What if Zhou Chongguang suddenly goes crazy and tells Qin Mu that he likes you? Do you think Qin Mu can still live?" Cher pursed her lips and didn't say anything. "You must regret it now, right?" Gu Mei chuckled. "But there's no medicine for regret in life." "Cher, I'm sorry." "You don't need to be sorry." Cher looked at Gu Mei coldly. "I'm not here to hear you apologize. I'm here to tell you that if you want to hurt Qin Mu, I'll make sure you can't get out of prison for the rest of your life. I can do what I say." Gu Mei was stunned. After a while, she asked softly, "Did Zhou Chongguang threaten you?" Gu Mei sneered. "He's a natural warrior. He can defeat you with one move. You don't dare to take the risk for Qin Mu, right?" Cher held her breath. After a long time, she said coldly, "It has nothing to do with you." She turned and left without hesitation. Gu Mei was behind her. "Tang Cher, is it because of Qin Mu or Yi Muyun that you made such a choice? You love him, don't you?" Snow's footsteps came to a halt. After a while, she turned and looked at Gu Mei. "You're right. I love him. I can wait." Cher smiled absent-mindedly. "I can wait until I can love him." "Gu Mei, I wait because I know he loves me. I won't wait forever for a man who doesn't love me." She added, "If you sleep with Zhou Chongguang, Gu Zhe, your brother will take the punishment for you." Gu Mei chuckled. "You are wrong. You should let Zhou Chongguang make mistakes and let Qin Mu give up." Cher looked at her, lowered her eyes, and murmured, "I can't afford to gamble. As long as Qin Mu was fine, she and Yi Muyun would be fine. If one day, something happened to Qin Mu because of Zhou Chongguang, then she would be finished." She knew that at the crucial moment, she would always make the right choice, because right now, she had no other choice. Just like that, she walked out in a straight line. Gu Zhe was waiting for her at the door. She was not surprised. She walked to Gu Zhe and said in a low voice, "Gu Zhe, from now on, you have to cooperate with me." Gu Zhe squinted his eyes, and his heart was beating wildly. He heard Cher say slowly, "Zhou Chongguang seduced Qin Mu." Gu Zhe was shocked. As Yi Muyun's confidant, he knew a little about the Qin family. Now, Zhou Chongguang had really hit Mr. Ye's weak spot. Needless to say, Mr. Yi would give in. No matter how harsh the conditions were, Mr. Yi would agree. Gu Zhe was even more shocked. What about Cher and Mr. Yi? Chapter 2067. Gu Zhe looked at Cher and didn't say anything for a long time. Cher smiled faintly and said in a quiet voice, "Let's leave it at that. Don't let brother know about what happened today." Gu Zhe was a little shocked and wanted to say something, but stopped himself. "I'll find a chance to tell him." Cher pursed her lips. Gu Zhe didn't say anything else and walked downstairs with her in silence. When they got into the car, Gu Zhe said calmly, "What's wrong with them?" Shui Er tilted her head to look at Gu Zhe and smiled. Perhaps it's because they've experienced darkness before, so they're desperately trying to grab onto that ray of sunshine. But they've never thought that Zhou Chongguang is the greatest darkness. She leaned her head against the car window and said tiredly, "We're always the first to go overboard." When Gu Zhe heard this, he knew that she was completely on Mr. Ye's side. But the more she stood on Mr. Ye's side, the more vulnerable she was. The two of them didn't speak along the way. He sent her all the way to Pei Garden. At this time, Yi Muyun hadn't returned yet. This was also the time that Gu Zhe had calculated. Gu Zhe left quickly and Cher walked upstairs slowly. She fell on the bed and didn't want to get up. She needed to think about it. Downstairs, Sister Li looked worried. She thought that the young couple had quarreled again and that Miss didn't look happy. So when Yi Muyun came back, Sister Li nagged again, "Go upstairs and coax him." Yi Muyun looked upstairs. "What's wrong?" "He looks a little absent-minded." Sister Li sighed. Hurry up and go up to take a look. Don't throw a tantrum again. Sister Lee secretly thought that young master would have to work harder in the future if he married a baby like Mississippi. Just as she was thinking about it, Yi Muyun had already walked upstairs to his bedroom, but there was no one there. After thinking for a while, he went to Cher's bedroom. She was lying down with a pillow covering her face. Yi Muyun smiled helplessly and pulled the pillow away from her face. Aren't you afraid of suffocating? Xuan-e looked at him pitifully, then threw her little body into his embrace. Brother. She softly called his name and rubbed against his chest like a little animal. He couldn't resist that kind of warmth. His heart was full and his voice was slightly hoarse. What's wrong? No. I just want to hug you. She lifted her little face and kissed his chin carelessly, then slowly moved to his lips. She had never been so proactive before, pestering him to the point where his soul almost left his body. Sister Lee was wrong. She wasn't throwing a tantrum. She was simply missing him. This kiss was getting hotter and hotter, and Yi Muyun couldn't resist it. The young man's forehead was soon covered in sweat. He took off the little body in his arms and said in a warm voice, Cher. He forced himself to calm down because he wanted to stay until the engagement night. He wasn't a saint, and he couldn't wait until the wedding night. However, there were still a few days before the engagement, and he wanted to wait. But there was a ball of fire in his arms, and she kept pressing against him. Slowly, his breathing became erratic. He pressed his hands on her shoulders and said in a warm voice, Cher, are you sure? His little one was full of blood. She nodded vigorously and then buried herself in his arms. Yi Muyun let out a deep breath and looked around. In the end, he still picked her up and walked to his bedroom. Chapter 2068. Cher clutched his shoulders, feeling extremely nervous. She pursed her lips and said, Brother, I'm scared. He lowered his head and kissed her on the lips. Cher, it's me. I'm the one who wants you. He kicked open the bedroom door roughly and kicked it again. The sound reverberated through the room. Sister Lee, who was downstairs, felt her heart skip a beat. She wondered if something had happened and wondered if she should go up to take a look. Upstairs, in the bedroom that was filled with a masculine scent, Yi Muyun was experiencing the biggest surprise of his life. Even though he had some understanding of this kind of thing, even though he had watched the films countless times, he only knew the essence of it at that moment. The little thing in his arms was a pure little vixen who had come to seduce him. He indulged himself in it and tried his best to give her the best. However, it was their first time, and the scene was not pleasant at all. The little girl hammered his shoulders, tears welling up in her eyes. Do you know how to do it? He kissed her and coaxed her. Bear with it for a while longer. Fortunately, he was a smart person and soon learned to draw inferences. Soon, the sounds in the bedroom became warm and lingered for a long time. Auntie Lee waited downstairs for a long time, but she didn't see anyone. She felt strange and decided to go upstairs to take a look. In the end, when she reached the young master's bedroom, she heard strange noises. Sister Lee was an experienced person. How could she not know what those sounds were? She blushed and did not know what to say. She paused for a while and eventually went downstairs. She stared at the table of dishes in a daze. Then she thought to herself that it was time to prepare supper. The two little ones probably would not come down for a while. As a young man who had just experienced the world, he could not stop for a while. Moreover, the little thing in his arms was begging him again and again. How could he stop? From 6 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. He did not let go of her and kept coming. Finally, when he was exhausted, he held her in his arms and kissed the beads of sweat on her forehead. He asked lovingly, Are you all right? The little person was still trembling in his arms, unable to say a word. He was somewhat satisfied and kissed her again. Does it still hurt? Cher lay in his arms, feeling a little shy. She didn't make a sound and just bit his shoulder. It's okay. He narrowed his eyes and chuckled after a long time. It doesn't hurt. Let's do it again? She was so flustered that she immediately hugged his body and begged him not to. Actually, he was also a little exhausted. It was also his first time, so he didn't know what to do. He only got the feeling towards the end. Just like that, he held her in his arms for a while until the sweat had cooled down. Then, he carried her to the bathroom for a hot bath. When he was wiping her down, Cher's little face turned to the side. "Be gentler." His gaze was deep and his movements were careless. For the first time, the two of them were a little awkward. They didn't even dare to make eye contact, afraid that they would recall the passionate scene just now. After settling her down and wrapping her in the bathrobe, he pinched her little face and smiled. "I'll go downstairs to get some food," Cher replied and watched him go downstairs. At this moment, the entire villa was quiet. Yi Muyun walked up the stairs in a relaxed mood. His heart was filled with an indescribable sense of contentment. Although it was not planned, tonight was undoubtedly wonderful. Chapter 2069. He walked into the kitchen. The supper prepared by Sister Lee was still hot. In addition to the usual supper, there were also 2 bowls of tonic soup. Yi Muyun shook his head and smiled, but he still took it upstairs. Pushing open the bedroom door, he saw Cher lying on the bed with her eyes closed. She seemed to be asleep. Her little face was blushing, and her long eyelashes were curled up with 2 drops of tears, which made her look weak and beautiful. The young man who had just tasted her sweetness was naturally filled with tenderness. He put the supper aside, held her soft little body in his arms, and kissed her lips lightly. Cher woke up soon. She blinked and looked at him, and then her face became redder. She called him brother softly. "Eat something," he said hoarsely. He felt that she was already his little wife, and that feeling was very subtle. It was different to have had it before. Cher nestled in his arms obediently. Looking at the soup in front of her, she frowned and asked, "What is this?" Yi Muyun's voice carried a hint of a smile. "This is the tonic soup Auntie Lee made for us." As soon as he said that, the little girl buried herself in his arms and said shyly, "Did Sister Lee know?" He seemed to know what she was thinking and teased her in her ear. "Baby, if you keep your voice down, probably no one will know." Cher was not convinced. She stared at him, but her voice was lingering. "It's obviously your voice." She thought of the sound he made when he was aroused and immediately covered her face. She never knew that a man's voice sounded better than a woman's. Cher buried herself in his arms and refused to get up. He smiled and pulled her out. "What's so embarrassing about it? It's natural for a man and a woman to have sex. But we're not married yet." She bit her lip, put her sharp chin on his shoulder, and looked at him blankly. Tonight, she didn't know why she wanted him so much and wanted him to hug her. They had sex naturally, and she didn't regret it. She didn't know when it started, but she was sure that in this life, she would only be with him. After having each other, she felt very good. He hugged her quietly and said in a hoarse voice, "Good girl, get up and eat something." She didn't say anything. He smiled bitterly and pinched her little ear. "Baby, I'm exhausted." Cher got up with a red face and hugged his neck with one hand. "You eat it then." Finally, there was a bowl of seafood porridge for the two to share. There was nothing better than a young couple. He hugged her, and neither of them felt sleepy. They hugged each other until it was almost 1 in the morning before they fell asleep. He woke up early, around 6 in the morning. After that, he pressed down on her again without any restraint. In the end, Cher gently closed her eyes and bit her lip. "You're shameless." Yi Muyun didn't care about his face anymore. He forced her to come. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, long past the time he went to the company. This was the first time for Mr. Yi. Gu Zhe's phone calls came one after the other, and he didn't stop. When he was satisfied, he finally let go of her. However, he didn't control himself, and Cher was a little hurt. The young man who had sex for the first time went to the pharmacy again and bought an ointment. He came back and personally applied it on her. He didn't leave and stayed with her the whole morning. Chapter 2070. On the other side, Gu Zhe was holding his phone, extremely surprised. Zi had always been unstoppable, rain or shine. However, he was a man after all, and he could quickly figure out the reason behind it. He shook his head and sighed. He had a feeling that this was the calm before the storm. Or rather, Cher was afraid of losing him, so she gave herself to Yi Muyun. On the other side, Yi Muyun hung up the phone and kissed the little girl contentedly before walking downstairs. Auntie Lee's face was full of joy, and the other servants also had smiles on their faces. Pei Yuan already had a tacit understanding about what happened last night. At this moment, it felt like the whole world was celebrating. Yi Muyun went downstairs to get the newspaper and went upstairs again. Snow was still asleep. She was sleeping soundly and she seemed to be in perfect health. His fingers gently stroked her little face, and he couldn't bear to let go of her. She seemed to be conscious, and she rubbed her little face against his palm. Yi Muyun's heart moved, and he whispered in her ear, "Cher, let's be together for the rest of our lives, okay?" The next life was too far away, and no one knew if it would happen, so he only wanted her to be by his side in this life. The little girl rubbed against him again. She didn't answer, but her actions were very warm. He chuckled deeply and habitually read through the newspaper once. Then he leaned against the headboard and used his phone to deal with work. He had never been so lazy before, but when he was with her, he felt that it was peaceful and beautiful. Cher didn't wake up until 4 in the afternoon. She had just opened her eyes when she was bitten on her cheek, accompanied by a man's hoarse voice. "You're awake?" Yi Muyun pressed his forehead against hers and said lovingly, "Sleepy little pig." Cher looked at him for a long time before she said, "How long have I been asleep?" She sat up and looked at the sky outside. The sun was shining brightly. "It's 4 o'clock, he said softly, reaching out to stroke her long hair. "Do you want to take a walk in the garden?" Cher's face was a little pale. She slowly sat up straight and looked up at him. "I want to go out for dinner." After what happened last night, even if she asked him for the moon in the sky, he would probably agree, let alone a meal. Cher lowered her eyes. "The one Mumu took me to yesterday was pretty good. She's so small, yet you're still following behind her? Let's see how good you are." His words were full of resentment towards iron for not becoming steel. Cher glared at him before getting up and bouncing towards the bathroom. However, she had been injured before, and the moment she bounced, she pulled a little and her face was bitter. He smiled and carried her into the bathroom. He patted her head comfortingly. "Call me when you're done. I won't let you walk today." She blushed and quickly brushed her teeth to hide it. He smiled and leaned against the side, waiting for her. After dawdling for 2 hours, Yi Muyun finally went out with his little yellow bun. The family was led by Sister Lee, and they all smiled and said that it didn't matter if they didn't come back. "The old people in the family are so open-minded now," Cher said in a low voice as she fastened her seatbelt. Yi Muyun chuckled and said, "They're not as open-minded as the little yellow bun at home." Cher's eyes widened. Was he talking about her? She snorted and said, "No, you can't help yourself." Chapter 2071. When they arrived at the restaurant that Qin Mu had gone to, the lights were on, and the street was full of neon lights. Cher got out of the car and looked at them greedily. She held Yi Muyun's arm with her little arm and leaned her face on his shoulder. "The moon is beautiful tonight." He looked down at her. "It seems that there is no moon tonight." The little girl was stunned and glared at him. Yi Muyun smiled, held her hand, and slowly walked into the restaurant. She followed behind him, her heart beating faster. Yes, she wanted him to see everything. She wouldn't hide it from him. She wanted him to handle things that she couldn't handle. Cher thought that she really didn't know what to do. And she knew that he wouldn't hurt Mumu. If she told Auntie Yi and Uncle Qin about this, they would be too sad. She still had this feeling. Sure enough, Qin Mu was inside, holding her little chin and watching Zhou Chongguang's performance with a faint smile on her face. "Mumu is here today? Have you made an appointment?" Yi Muyun raised his eyebrows, looked at the little girl, and asked in a low voice. Cher shook her head. "No. It should be Mumu who comes every day." As she spoke, she sighed softly and closed her eyes again. Qin Mu didn't notice their existence. Yi Muyun was about to go over, but Cher stopped him and said softly, "She has an appointment with a friend." Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and looked at her with a strange expression. The waiter arranged for them to sit down, but no one was in the mood to order. Their eyes were fixed on Qin Mu's table. After a while, Yi Muyun's eyes stopped because he saw Zhou Chongguang. Zhou Chongguang walked to Qin Mu's side and naturally lowered his head to kiss her. Qin Mu looked up and smiled. Her eyes were bright, as if there were countless little stars hidden in them. Yi Muyun recognized that kind of gaze. His little Shui would sometimes look at him like that. In other words, Qin Mu was now with Zhou Chongguang? Just as he was about to stand up, Cher held his hand. Mu Yun, don't go. He calmed down and looked at her. She called him Mu Yun just now. She must have known about Qin Mu long ago. When did you know? He asked in a low, husky voice. Cher pursed her lips. Yesterday. Afraid that he would act rashly, she pressed his hand down forcefully. Let's talk somewhere else. Yi Muyun was naturally unwilling, and his voice became even more hoarse. You spent so much effort just to bring me to see this scene? He was a little embarrassed because Mumu was only 14 years old. Cher lowered her eyes, but her voice was a little choked. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. That night, Mumu told me that she had someone she liked. I didn't expect that person to be Zhou Chongguang. She raised her eyes, and there were some tears in them. I beg you, don't be impulsive. Mumu can't stand the stimulation. Zhou Chongguang knew Qin Mu's illness better than Cher. After hearing her words, he slowly calmed down and said in a cold voice, Leave this matter to me, okay? Cher looked at him and was unwilling to let go of his hand. Don't you blame me? Yi Muyun thought of her abnormal behavior last night and how frightened she was at this time. He closed his eyes and said, No. He got up and carried her out of the restaurant. Neither of them was in the mood to eat, so they found a health tea house. They sat face to face, and he had been waiting for her to speak. Chapter 2072. Yi Muyun looked at her without any expression on his face. In just a moment he was shocked. He held Cher's hand with his fingers, which made her feel extreme pain, but she didn't say a word and let him hold it. After a long time, a murderous look appeared on Yi Muyun's face. Cher walked over, hugged him from behind, and buried her face in the back of his neck. Cher, did you pity me last night? His voice was low. Snow shook her head behind his back. Her voice was soft as she said, No, no. She tightened her little arms and murmured, That's because I want to be with you. Or it could be said that Qin Mu's matter had hit her too hard. She was the same as him. Mumu was his sister and also her sister. In addition, this person was Zhou Chongguang, so she had no reason not to worry. As they hugged each other like this, Yi Muyun calmed down. Naturally, he had already thought of 100 ways to kill Zhou Chongguang. But Cher hugged him and said in a low voice, Think about Mumu. Can Mumu withstand such a blow? He didn't say it, but she already knew that he couldn't tolerate Zhou Chongguang, and he must have used some underhanded means. Cher didn't care about these at this time. She only cared about Qin Mu. I'm not helping Zhou Chongguang. He can't die. She made it very clear. You can't take the risk. Yi Muyun's voice had never been so helpless and fragile. He let her hug him. How many times had he been her reliance, and how many times had he used all kinds of force on her? But at this time, they were equal, and he needed her comfort. Mu Yun, talk to him and see what he wants. Cher put her face against his cheek. I don't agree with Mumu being with him either. If Zhou Chongguang was sincere, then no one would have any reason to object. But now, no one could hand Mumu over to him. Yi Muyun listened to her words, reached out and hugged her. After a while, he said softly, Okay, I will talk to him. At this moment he had already given up on acquiring glory. Now, Zhou Chongguang had indeed won. No one dared to joke about Mumu's life. Cher nodded. She gestured for a waiter and ordered 2 servings of nutritious meals, the kind that were quite healthy. Yi Muyun reached out and ruffled her hair. His tone was indifferent as he said, My little milkshake is sensible now. In the past, she would have protested, but not today. She kept hugging him. After a long time, Yi Muyun burst into laughter. Cher, I'm not that fragile. Hurry up and eat. Oh, she replied and sat down to eat quietly. The atmosphere was quite heavy. After dinner, he sent her back first and drove back himself. He was always worried about Mumu, who was his sister. The restaurant closed at 10 o'clock, but Qin Mu stayed there until 10 o'clock. Yi Muyun was annoyed when he saw that. No wonder Mumu's cram school was very late. It turned out that he had come here. Then Qin Mo was an accomplice. However, no matter how angry he was, he had to endure it and watch Qin Mu get into Zhou Chongguang's car. He followed them all the way. Fortunately, Zhou Chongguang sent Mumu directly to the gate of the Qin's mansion, which meant that he did not want to avoid trouble. Yi Muyun parked his car a little far away. After watching Qin Mu get out of the car and walk into the Qin's mansion, he opened the door and got out. He waved his fist at Zhou Chongguang. Bastard! Chapter 2073. In the dark night, Zhou Chongguang let out a slightly evil smile. Mr. Yi also stalks people. His tone was indifferent as he wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. Yi Muyun's fingers clenched into a fist as he restrained himself from making a move. He leaned against the front of his sports car and looked at Zhou Chongguang. What do I have to do for you to leave Qin Mu? Zhou Chongguang slowly wiped the corner of his mouth, a faint smile on his face. Mr. Yi is still so high and mighty. I don't like to beat around the bush. I can stop buying Rongguang and I can even make Rongguang better than before. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes at Zhou Chongguang. Leave Qin Mu and I'll send her overseas. He had already thought it through. He didn't have anyone he could trust except Cher. At this moment, in his heart, Cher wasn't a mischievous child, but a little wife who could help him. Zhou Chongguang sneered. What about my father? Can Mr. Yi bring him back to life? In the dark night, his handsome face was tainted with evil. He died of a heart attack. Yes, his psychological endurance was too weak. He wasn't a match for Mr. Yi, who was 30 years younger than him. But his life was gone just like that. Mr. Yi, if it were you, would you let him off easily? Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes even more. Then what do you want? Mr. Yi owns 40% of King Entertainment's shares. Zhou Chongguang smiled. I wonder if in Mr. Ye's heart, is Qin Mu worth that price? Impossible. Yi Muyun's voice was tense. Zhou Chongguang, give up on that idea. Of course, Mr. Yi has another choice. Zhou Chongguang smiled. Give me your fiancée. I'll take her abroad and never come back. He added, as for Boyd, I'm not interested. I've already taken away Mr. Ye's most precious thing. Zhou Chongguang's every word was like a knife, and each knife was fatal. He was using the thing that Yi Muyun cared about the most to make a deal. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes, his voice as cold as ice. You know I can make you disappear at any time. Zhou Chongguang looked at him and smiled faintly. Mr. Yi can give it a try. As he spoke, he opened the car door and drove away. Yi Muyun didn't stop him. He listened to Cher's words. At this moment, he really couldn't act rashly, even though he really wanted to kill Zhou Chongguang right now. And now, he was in a dilemma. Should he tell his parents about this? He got into the car and drove into the Qin residence. Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin were a little surprised. Qin Mu and Qin Mo were eating supper. Yi Muyun glared at little Qin Mo. Qin Mo was a little confused. He didn't know how he had offended his brother. Why are you back so late? Yi Liangqiu asked curiously. Yi Muyun smiled and sat next to Qin Mu. He reached out and ruffled Qin Mu's hair. I just happened to pass by. Where's Cher? She didn't come with you? Yi Liangqiu asked. She had already gone to instruct the servants to make supper for the young master. Yi Muyun was a little silent as he ate. No one knew a son better than a mother. When Yi Liangqiu saw his abnormal behavior, he could roughly guess that he had something on his mind. He thought that he was at odds with Xuan Er and wanted to say a few words to console him, but he didn't expect that to be the case. Chapter 2074. Yi Muyun quietly finished his supper and watched the two little ones go upstairs to sleep. He and Mr. and Mrs. Qin were still sitting on the sofa downstairs. After the servants served them tea, they left. What's wrong? It's rare for you to look so uneasy. Yi Liangqiu said with concern. Cher is still young. Try to coax her more. Yi Muyun shook his head. Mom, it's not about Cher. Yi Liangqiu found it strange. If it wasn't about Cher, why was her son so worried? She looked at Qin Anlin and smiled. Did our son meet another Cher Zhang or Cher Wang? That's troublesome, Qin Anlin also smiled. After a while, he stopped joking. Mu-yun, if you have something to say, just say it. Yi Mu-yun looked at his parents, took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and took a puff. Mr. and Mrs. Qin looked at each other and knew that it was a big deal. Their son never smoked at home. Dad, Mu-mu is with Zhou Chongguang. Yi Mu-yun tried his best to speak of this matter in a calm tone, but when he spoke of the specifics, his fingers that were holding the cigarette trembled slightly. Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu were both stunned. Qin Mu had always been very obedient. Except for her illness, she had always been worry-free. Now she was in love. Of all people, she was with Zhou Chongguang. His father immediately gritted his teeth. It was Zhou Chongguang who seduced Mu-mu, wasn't it? Yi Liangqiu looked at Yi Mu-yun. He did not deny it. The three of them were silent. No one saw Qin Mu, who was standing at the staircase on the second floor. She was listening quietly, and there was a hint of contemplation on her face. The matter was put on hold because no one dared to take the risk. When Yi Mu-yun returned to Pei Garden, it was already late at night. He slowly walked upstairs. Cher had already fallen asleep, but she didn't seem to be sleeping well. Her brows were furrowed. He reached out and gently caressed her little face, murmuring, "I won't let you leave me." Even if he had to lose everything, he wanted to be with her. After watching for a while, he went to the bathroom to take a shower. When he came out, he smoked 2 cigarettes on the balcony. Lifting the blanket, he climbed onto the bed and lay beside her. Perhaps she felt the coolness of his body, but she resisted it. However, she was quickly pulled into his arms, and after hugging for a while, they did it again. She woke up and did not resist. She obediently lay in his arms. Under the warm yellow light, her features were exquisite, and her eyes were filled with deep love for him. He couldn't control his emotions, so he couldn't be gentle anymore. He was so rough that he made her cry. Later, she cried out in pain. Only then did he calm down. He lowered his head to look at her and kissed her. For a moment, they were in an extremely good mood. After that, she was so tired that she fell asleep. She lay in his arms. However, Yi Mu-yun didn't fall asleep. He leaned against her and gently rubbed her long fluffy hair with his fingers. Late at night, she woke up and looked up at him. "Brother, why aren't you sleeping?" He replied softly, "I can't sleep." She buried her little face in his neck and hugged his waist with her little hands, looking like she depended on him. Yi Mu-yun's voice was a little low. "Cher, I've never felt that I've done anything wrong, but this time am I wrong?" He wasn't a conflicted person, and he never regretted anything. But now that it was related to Mu-mu, he really reflected on it. Was he wrong? Chapter 2075. It's not your fault. She hugged him. It's my fault. If I didn't want freedom, I wouldn't have provoked Zhou Chongguang. Yi Mu-yun reached out to hug her and sighed softly. Cher, how can I blame you? He rubbed her. Don't think too much, okay? Cher lay in his arms obediently. After a while, she raised her eyes and looked at him. Her voice was a little soft. You too. To him, these 3 words were salvation. He looked at his little cutie, who was so sensible and soothed the anxiety in his heart. In the end, he hugged her and coaxed her to sleep. He did not sleep until dawn. At dawn, Cher opened her eyes and did not see anyone. She immediately lifted the quilt and grabbed the alarm clock to look at it. It was already 9 o'clock. She ran down in her pajamas and asked Sister Lee, "Did brother go to the company?" Sister Lee smiled and said, "He went early in the morning. He told me not to disturb your sleep. I'll call him later." Cher nodded and did not say anything else. She slowly walked upstairs. In fact, she wanted to ask Yi Mu-yun's plan, but she did not dare to. After staying at home for a long time, she called Qin Mu. It was noon. Qin Mu was eating, but she could tell that he was not at school. "Mu-mu, where are you?" Cher asked sensitively. At this time, she was a little resistant to Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang being together. She really could not accept that Mu-mu was so young. Qin Mu's voice was still soft. "I'm with Zhou Chongguang." "Cher, do you want to come?" Her voice was very light. "By the way, you can ask Zhou Chongguang to play Ode to Alice for your engagement with my brother." He plays this song very well. Cher was speechless for a moment. She wondered if Zhou Chongguang had deceived Mumu with this song. Her throat seemed to be blocked, and so did her heart. She thought about it and decided to go over. She didn't ask the driver to send her, but took a taxi herself. Fortunately, Zhou Chongguang did not take Mumu to a messy place, but to an elegant restaurant. Cher walked to the door and slowly walked in. Qin Mu noticed her and waved her over. Her expression was joyful, the expression of love. Cher was a little absent-minded. This Qin Mu was very healthy, very good. She recalled the time when Qin Mu's skinny body refused to eat due to depression and was on her last breath. At that time, Qin Mu didn't let her go either. Cher would never forget that blood for the rest of her life. She sat down. Zhou Chongguang's eyes were clear, just like the ray of sunshine that Gu Mei and Qin Mu liked. Sometimes, Cher couldn't be sure whether what had happened was real or fake. Was Zhou Chongguang the sun or the night? I've told Chongguang that when you and my brother get married, he will play a song for you. Qin Mu was young, but she was already gentle and graceful. Cher laughed hoarsely. It's still early for me to get married. I'm only 18 years old. She said this to Zhou Chongguang, which was equivalent to telling him that Mumu was only 14 years old. She didn't know whether he felt guilty or not. She only knew that Zhou Chongguang would not let go. It was like a drowning man grabbing a piece of driftwood. How could he let go? If he let go, he would be smashed into pieces. Zhou Chongguang smiled and then looked at Qin Mu. It's a little early for you to get married at the age of 18. Qin Mu smiled and stuck out her tongue mischievously. I remembered wrongly. Chapter 2076. Zhou Chongguang nodded at her, looking very affectionate. After they left, Cher's face turned cold, and her voice was a little agitated. Zhou Chongguang, do you know that Qin Mu is only 14 years old? Zhou Chongguang smiled and picked up the aperitif on the table. Of course. But her body is already like that of an 18-year-old girl, isn't it? It's not even worse than yours. Cher was in a trance for a moment. She looked at the man in front of her. Yes, it was a man. Even if he had carried her to the infirmary 2 months ago, she said softly, You're a beast. Zhou Chongguang laughed mockingly. Are you talking about that? What about Yi Muyun? Isn't he a beast? If he isn't a beast, why are there so many hickeys on your neck? He suddenly got up, crossed half the table, bent down to look her in the eye, and spat out word by word, Don't tell me, you haven't done it. Cher's little face was very cold, and her voice was even colder. It has nothing to do with you. Zhou Chongguang suddenly grabbed her hand. Tang Cher, we're still relatives in the future. I still have to call you sister-in-law like Qin Mu. If Qin Mu knows that I've always liked her respected sister-in-law, what do you think she will think? Will she be unable to bear this kind of blow? I don't know if she can bear it, but I know you're despicable. Cher broke free from his hand and sneered. Zhou Chongguang, don't you look at your own face? Do you think Mumu will always love you like this? As long as I want to, I can. Zhou Chongguang chuckled. Cher's little face was tense, and she became even colder. Then you'd better clamp your tail between your legs. Right at this moment, Zhou Chongguang suddenly sat down, and his face no longer had the evil aura from before. Instead, there was a faint smile on his face, and he looked gentle like jade. Cher cursed in her heart. She really couldn't tell that Zhou Chongguang was not only good at playing the piano, but also good at acting. She also sat up straight because she knew that Qin Mu was back. What are you guys talking about? Qin Mu sat down, held her chin, and looked around. Cher, your meal hasn't arrived yet. She looked at the time. I probably have to go to class. Do you want Chongguang to eat with you? There's no need for that. Let him take you to class. Snow forced a smile onto her face. Zhou Chongguang didn't comment. He helped Qin Mu up and said goodbye to Cher. They left together. The waiter just came over with the meal. Cher was not in the mood to eat, but she was so angry that she ate up the set meal, and her stomach was full. Then she called Yi Muyun. Brother, I want to go to school. Yi Muyun nodded. No one is stopping you. I mean, I want to be in the same class as Mumu, the little girl emphasized. After a long silence, Yi Muyun said softly, Cher, are you sure? Mumu is only in the second year of junior high. Qin Mu didn't seek to improve academically, but he did well in the corner interest classes. That was why he was still in the second year of middle school. His little wife, on the other hand, had already entered university. If she were to go back to the second year of middle school, what kind of brain circuits did she have? But since she said so, he also told her his plan. Cher, after we get engaged, can I send you and Mumu to the United States? Take it as taking care of her for me. Especially before Qin Mu had a showdown with her family, he had to send her away. Cher was stunned at first, but then she understood, because he would have more work in New York in the future. Chapter 2077. Very obedient. Yi Muyun praised her a little. If only Mumu was as obedient as you. Cher thought of something and said softly, Mumu said that Zhou Chongguang will play when we get engaged. In his dreams. Yi Muyun spat out these 3 words. At this time, Gu Zhe called him for a meeting, so he said goodbye and told her to go home early. Cher obediently hung up the phone and stroked her belly. Suddenly, she felt that things were not so bad. At this time, it was less than a week before her and Yi Muyun's engagement. He came back very late every day, as if he had worked overtime for a long time. She didn't ask, but she knew that it was because of Glory. It was easy to go up the mountain, but it was difficult to go down the mountain. He had done so much in the early stage of buying Glory, and now he had to restore it. He had spent more energy and money than before. Even though he had not reached an agreement with Zhou Chongguang, Glory had indeed been returned to Zhou Chongguang. After that, Yi Muyun made an appointment with Zhou Chongguang for his father in a private room of a club. Yi Muyun did not attend this interview himself, because he was afraid that he would not be able to control himself and beat Zhou Chongguang to the ground. He had been guarding outside and had smoked about half a pack of cigarettes. However, he did not expect that his father was even more violent than him. Not only did Zhou Chongguang look for his teeth on the ground, but he also almost looked for his kidneys on the ground. Qin Anlin was really ruthless when he hit him. As a father, he had raised his little daughter up, and suddenly a beast came to him. No one would be willing to do it. There was a big commotion inside the room. Yi Muyun raised his eyes slightly and ignored it. He knew that Zhou Chongguang did not dare to fight back. That man held the Qin family's lifeblood, but he still had to endure this kind of pain. He knew that if he was not beaten to death, Qin Mu would still be his, and he could also play the trick of injuring himself. Yi Muyun smiled mockingly. Even his father couldn't remain calm. No one could remain calm about this matter. The door suddenly opened and Qin Anlin walked out. Muyun, take him away. I'll teach him a lesson later. Yi Muyun couldn't help laughing. Don't you care about Mumu's feelings? That girl doesn't know anything. Qin Anlin said coldly, if I don't kill her today, my surname is not Qin. He dared to touch my daughter, Qin Anlin. Let's see how many lives he has. Yi Muyun sighed. Dad, you're becoming more and more like Grandpa. You mean that old thing, Su Shirqing? Qin Anlin frowned. He is a scum. In the future, don't mention this person in front of your mother. This hatred was immense. But Yi Muyun didn't agree with his son's approach. He smiled faintly and said, when Mumu finds out, she will hate you. Why don't you kill her now? Qin Anlin looked at his son and patted him on the shoulder. In fact, you're more like Su Shirqing. I said I won't mention it. Yi Muyun frowned and then walked into the private room. As soon as he entered the room, he covered his nose. What a strong smell of blood. Zhou Chongguang was lying on the ground, his face covered with blood, and his chest was heaving up and down. You can kill me now. It's useless to scare me. Yi Muyun stepped on Zhou Chongguang's chest and sneered. I can't scare you, can I? Zhou Chongguang coughed up a mouthful of blood. Yi Muyun, I have nothing to lose. I'm not like you, who have scruples. Yi Muyun twisted his foot gently a few times, and Zhou Chongguang spat out a few mouthfuls of blood in succession. It seemed that he was hanging by a thread. Chapter 2078. Yi Muyun's voice was very faint. You still have one last chance to make a choice. Zhou Chongguang bent over and spat out mouthfuls of blood. His body was also twitching slightly. Zhou Chongguang, you should know me a little. Even if I kill you now, it's not a big deal. Yi Muyun squatted down and reached out to pat Zhou Chongguang's face. Zhou Chongguang raised his eyes, which were a little weak. He looked at them for a long time and chuckled. He tried his best to turn his body over and lay flat. He turned his head to look at Yi Muyun and said, "You can give it a try. See if your baby sister can also survive." The blue veins on Yi Muyun's forehead popped out. He slowly stood up. At this time, he really wanted to kick this scourge to death. He really kicked him hard and hard. Zhou Chongguang spat out a mouthful of blood, and the whole room was filled with the smell of blood. In the end, Qin Anlin came in and grabbed Yi Muyun. "Okay, this guy is sure that you don't dare to kill him, and he knows that pestering Mumu is the only way out. Otherwise, if Mumu was fine, the first thing Yi Muyun would do was to chop Zhou Chongguang to vent his hatred." Yi Muyun stopped and looked at Zhou Chongguang, who was lying on the ground. At this time, Zhou Chongguang had fallen into a coma and was on the verge of death. "Call an ambulance." Qin Anlin shook his head. He's really a tough nut to crack. He won't let go even after being beaten like this. Yi Muyun was also very upset. He scratched his head, but he still listened to Qin Anlin and made the call. At this time, it didn't matter if Zhou Chongguang died. The key was that if he disappeared, Mumu would probably not be able to bear it. Mumu was the only weakness of the Qin family. If Mumu didn't have that disease, Yi Muyun would have directly chopped him up based on what Zhou Chongguang had done. The ambulance drove over and carried Zhou Chongguang to the hospital. The club knew that it was Mr. Yi who did it, so no one dared to make a sound. Qin Anlin and Yi Muyun didn't leave immediately. Instead, they smoked 2 cigarettes and calmed down. Qin Anlin patted Yi Muyun's shoulder and advised in a faint voice, "Take it slow. Muyun, why don't we get Mumu abroad first? We'll teach this guy a lesson. Do you think Mumu will still like him if he loses a leg or an arm?" Yi Muyun leaned against the wall and puffed out a cloud of smoke. When he heard his father's words, he glanced sideways. "Don't you understand your daughter's temperament? Not to mention losing an arm or a leg, even if all the parts of his body were gone, as long as the main body was called Zhou Chongguang, Mumu would still be stubborn." Qin Anlin was momentarily at a loss for words. After a while, he thought of something and said, "Why don't we hold a party for Mumu and find some young pianists? We'll find someone like Zhou Chongguang." Yi Muyun looked at his father and obviously felt that as he got older, his IQ was getting lower and lower. He pursed his lips and said, "Zhou Chongguang is not dead yet. Will she fall in love with someone else? Let's try everything we can." Qin Anlin's eyes lit up, and he felt that this plan was feasible. However, he thought of something else and coughed softly. "Do you think Zhou Chongguang will tell Mumu that we almost killed him?" "No." Yi Muyun sneered. His pride won't allow him to do so. Qin Anlin was relieved, but Yi Muyun couldn't help asking his father, "Dad, have you had a physical examination recently?" Chapter 2079. Qin Anlin didn't get it yet. He looked at his son. "What's wrong? Let me accompany you to do a brain CT scan when I'm free. Your health is my happiness," Yi Muyun said very tactfully. Qin Anlin snorted. "You brat." But he didn't say anything. He just let Yi Muyun confirm the engagement. Yi Muyun returned to the company and called the company's public relations manager Lin. She was a beauty. Manager Lin was a little uneasy. Mr. Yi wasn't easy to get along with. Nothing good would happen if she called him over. However, she stood in Mr. Ye's office for a long time. Mr. Yi didn't say anything. He just rubbed his good-looking chin with one hand. Many girls in the company liked Mr. Ye's looks. But Mr. Yi was too cold and he was a few years younger than them. So, no one in the company dared to have any ideas on Mr. Yi. Yi Muyun thought for a long time before asking lightly, "Which pianists in the country recently? I want young ones no more than 25 years old?" Manager Lin was stunned. Mr. Yi was interested in men, and all professions had preferences? She couldn't figure it out and didn't reply for a while. Doesn't your public relations department often plan events? It should be very clear. Yi Muyun's voice had a hint of displeasure. Manager Lin immediately replied, there are a few famous ones. But Mr. Yi, do you have any special requirements for their looks? Yi Muyun finally knew that Manager Lin had misunderstood. He glanced at her and said lightly, it's my engagement. Cher asked someone to play Alice. As for the looks, it depends on her mood. Send the photos to my email. Manager Lin understood that this matter must be done well. This pianist was handsome, but he couldn't be more handsome than Mr. Yi. In fact, how many people could be more handsome than Mr. Yi? Manager Lin left and sent the list of names to Yi Muyun's email in less than half an hour. Yi Muyun opened it and glanced at it. In the end, she still left the decision to her wife. Cher was also a young girl, so she should know more about young girls. After he got off work and returned to Pei Garden, he went to the study after dinner. Cher was curled up on the bed playing with her tablet. After he finished showering, she was still in the same position. Won't your eyes hurt from looking at it? Wearing a bathrobe, he sat beside her and snatched the things from her hands. She was playing a game, and even though she was in a mess, she still looked like she was enjoying it. Cher snorted. I'm not done yet. He chose to leave, took her with one hand, and pressed her into his arms. His voice became a little more gentle. Cher, I'm going to talk to you about something serious. She was surprised. He still had something serious to talk to her about? But thinking about it, it should be about Mumu, so the little girl sat up in his arms. He glanced at her and then opened the email. There were photos of several young musicians in it. Which one is the most good-looking? He looked at her and asked. Cher flipped through it and looked up. They all play the piano? Yi Muyun smiled. Cher bit her lower lip. But none of them are as good-looking as Zhou Chongguang. I guess Mumu won't like them. She felt that there was nothing wrong with her words, but after saying that, Yi Muyun's voice sounded dangerously. Do you think Zhou Chongguang is good-looking? Chapter 2080. In the end, she was pressed down. Yi Muyun's fingers gently stroked her red lips, and his voice became more dangerous. Is he better looking than me? Cher's back hurt. She glared at him with tears in her eyes and said, if you do this again, I'll say yes. Did I hurt you? His expression was unfathomable. She pouted and snorted softly. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and looked at her. Then I'll be gentle, okay? It was probably because of Mumu. Although they had sex before, they didn't really indulge in it. It was also probably because he had beaten Zhou Chongguang so badly today that he felt happy and in a good mood. However, Cher was tortured to the point that she wished she was dead. She kept begging him, but he didn't let her go. It was already a few hours later when they finished. She lay in his arms, sweating profusely, and pointed at a photo. He looks a little like Huang Xian. Yi Muyun looked at it but didn't say anything. After indulging in it for so long, neither of them had the strength to wash up, so they fell asleep. Early in the morning, Cher was woken up by a kiss. She opened her eyes and saw that Yi Muyun was tying a tie. She turned over and lay on her stomach, looking at him and gently hooking his tie with her little hand. He bent down and kissed her lightly on the lips. Help me tie it, okay? As he said that, he dragged her little body out of the quilt. As soon as Cher got out of the quilt, she felt that he did it on purpose. This was because she was only wearing a white silk camisole, and it was the kind that was very close-fitting. It was the kind that was very seductive, especially under the morning light. The fabric was a little translucent. She knelt down and looked up. Her long ink-like hair was scattered behind her, showing her small curves. Yi Muyun held her waist and said in a hoarse voice, "You're such a torturous little thing." Cher bit her lips. She suddenly gave up on the tie and hugged him instead. She wrapped her arms and legs around him. Even her soul had disappeared. "This is what you call torture." She kissed his chin. Her voice was soft and gentle, carrying a hint of pure temptation. Yi Muyun raised her hand to look at her watch and bit her little ear. "We have to leave in half an hour. But if I hurry, I should be able to make it in time." His voice was slightly sinister. Then he picked her up and walked straight to the French window. The white curtains were beautiful, and there was a beige sofa in the corner. The morning sun shone on it, making it look especially warm. Cher was placed on top of him, and the tie that he had just finished tying was loosened once again. "Brother, you are never late." She moved her small body in fear, shrinking into the sofa. But the more she acted like this, the more he wanted to bully her. This time, not only did he indulge himself, but he also enjoyed himself to the fullest. By the time it ended, he was naturally late. Mr. Yi carried the little girl back to the bed, kissed her forehead, and comforted her with a smile. "You can sleep more. You can discuss the engagement with Mom in the afternoon. As for the person who will play the piano, you can choose. I'll ask Manager Lin to contact them." Cher was still angry at him for not being able to control himself. She snorted softly and didn't say a word. Yi Muyun smiled, reached out to rub her hair, and went straight to work. When he went downstairs, he couldn't help but say a few words to Sister Lee. Chapter 2081. Sister Lee was also happy. Seeing that the little girl didn't come downstairs for breakfast, she understood that the young couple had slept a little late last night. It wasn't that her sister Lee was praising her family, but the young master's stamina and physical fitness were amazing. Yes, this was the legendary 7 times in one night. Sister Lee thought happily, Miss was really blessed. What's the use of a man being good-looking? Even if he was good-looking, he still had to be useful. Look at the young master's face today, his nose was straight. One look and you could tell that he was a man among men. The consumption was too much, he had to replenish it. Sister Lee happily brought the soup and water over. Although Yi Muyun felt that it was a bit unscientific to have such a tonic for breakfast, it was also the old lady's kind intentions. He couldn't bear to ignore her and drank it in one gulp. Sister Lee was satisfied and happily sent the young master off. She felt that she already had a little young master and little miss in front of her. It would be best if they could have 2 at once. When Yi Muyun went to the company, he first summoned Manager Lin. Mr. Yi had summoned him twice. Manager Lin's face lit up, and she proudly walked into Mr. Ye's office in high heels. Don't think that Mr. Yi was just a vice president now. One had to know that there were only 2 people above Mr. Yi. One was President Zhao. Who was that person? He was President Tang's stepfather, and who was Mr. Yi? President Tang's son-in-law, the future successor of Boy. Who in the company didn't want to curry favor with Mr. Yi? Manager Lin didn't have the chance before, but now that she had the chance, she had to use all her strength to curry favor. But she knew that no matter how handsome Mr. Yi was, no matter how capable he was, she couldn't seduce him. After all, Boy was Tang. That's it. Yi Muyun pointed. Manager Lin looked at it from half a meter away and nodded. Okay, Mr. Yi, I will contact him. I just don't know if the appearance fee will be paid from the company or personally. Yi Muyun said lightly, tell me the number, and I will write you a personal check later. Manager Lin indicated that he understood. Just as he was about to leave, he noticed a small hickey on Chairman Ye's neck. If he didn't pay attention, he wouldn't have noticed it. Looking closely, it was still warm and fresh. She thought to herself, no wonder Mr. Yi was late, so early in the morning. Yi Muyun stretched out his hand and touched it. Thinking about how he and Shuang had a good relationship, he wanted to be ruthless. Shuang seemed to have bitten his neck a few times. At that time, he was feeling hot and didn't pay attention to it, but now he remembered. Young men naturally couldn't let go of this kind of thing, especially when it was a member of the opposite sex that he wasn't familiar with. So young Mr. Yi nodded and said in a reserved manner, I got it. You can leave first. Manager Lin understood. It seemed that Mr. Yi was still a newbie. She went out and closed the door. Yi Muyun had already got up and walked quickly to the bathroom, carefully checking his neck in the mirror. He reached out to pull his shirt, but it still couldn't stop it. He frowned and narrowed his eyes. At this time, Guze came in and said lightly, Mr. Yi, the meeting is about to start. Yi Muyun checked himself in the mirror for a while, then stood up straight. Okay, I will be there in a moment. He thought that not everyone was as meticulous as Manager Lin, right? Chapter 2082. After the meeting, Yi Muyun looked down and found that the expressions of his subordinates were a little intriguing. He paused for a moment and said lightly, "Everyone, write a report for today's meeting. I want to see it on my desk before I get off work." There was a lot of wailing, but he calmly got up and left the meeting room as if he didn't see it. Gu Zhe followed him. Yi Muyun didn't go back to the office. Instead, he went to the smoking area, leaned against the aisle, and quietly lit a cigarette. Gu Zhe leaned against the seat opposite him and smiled. "Do you really want someone to write a report? Just because I saw the hickey on your neck?" Yi Muyun glanced at Gu Zhe and said, "Nonsense." Gu Zhe smiled and said, "I heard from Manager Lin that you want to find a young and good-looking person to play the piano?" Yi Muyun nodded, threw away the cigarette butt, and stamped it out with his calf leather shoes. He said lightly, "Zhou Chongguang was sent to the hospital by Ming. So you want to find someone to seduce your sister?" Gu Zhe shook his head and laughed. "Mumu is only 14 years old." Yi Muyun suddenly narrowed his eyes and looked at Gu Zhe. "How did you know about this?" Gu Zhe was silent for a while before he said, "It was Cher who warned Gu Mei not to have anything to do with Zhou Chongguang anymore." Gu Zhe sighed and said, "In fact, I don't want her to still miss Zhou. You should know how I feel." Yi Muyun was silent. Gu Zhe continued, "Cher is very concerned about you and Mumu." After that, Gu Zhe left first. Yi Muyun stood there for a while, smoked a cigarette, and carefully thought about Gu Zhe's words. After a long time, he smiled. During the lunch break, he asked his secretary to order a bouquet of lilies and took it to the hospital. In the VIP ward of Xingyuan Hospital, Yi Muyun pushed the door open and entered. In the large ward, there were only Zhou Chongguang and a little nurse, who was helping to change the drip. Yi Muyun looked over and saw that Zhou Chongguang's face was covered with white gauze, like a mummy. He pulled a chair aside and put the bouquet of lilies on the small table next to the bed. "Do you like lilies?" Zhou Chongguang originally thought it was a doctor, but when he heard his voice, he slowly turned his head and looked at the bouquet of flowers with a slightly frightened gaze. With great difficulty, he opened his mouth and said, "Take it away, take it away." Yi Muyun smiled faintly and shrugged. She took out a cigarette and lit it. Her tone was indifferent. "I'll wait here for you to change your mind." After the nurse was done with the drip, she looked down and saw that it was Yi Muyun. She nodded and said, "Mr. Yi?" Then, she noticed that there was something wrong with Zhou Chongguang's expression. She looked at the bouquet of flowers and said hesitantly, "Mr. Yi, the patient seems to be allergic to lilies. Should we take them outside?" Yi Muyun asked the nurse seriously, "Will allergies kill people?" The nurse was stunned for a moment, then shook her head. "Usually not. But the patient will be in a lot of pain, especially Mr. Zhou, who has injuries all over his body. It's good that he won't die. Put the medical fees on my account." Yi Muyun's tone was very calm. "Now you can leave first." The nurse hesitated for a long time, then finally gave in. With Yi Muyun's status, even the director didn't dare to do anything to him, let alone a little nurse like her. The nurse went out and even considerately closed the door. Chapter 2083. At this moment, Zhou Chongguang's face had already turned purple. Half of it was from anger, and the other half was from the pollen. His two eyes stared at Yi Muyun, and his voice was hoarse. "What do you want to do?" Yi Muyun didn't say anything. He just leaned there and smoked, his expression calm. Finally, Zhou Chongguang couldn't take it anymore, and he sneezed. Then it was the second one, the third one, and he simply couldn't stop. All the wounds on his body were affected, and they trembled. It was simply inhuman torture. At this moment, Yi Muyun's voice slowly sounded, "I've investigated, you're allergic to lilies. Zhou Chongguang, are you in pain now?" Zhou Chongguang's eyes were very deep, and he kept staring at Yi Muyun. He had the backbone not to say a word. Allergies made him very painful, and it was almost a living hell. He knew that if he opened his mouth he would end the pain, but he couldn't. He, who had lost Qin Mu, could easily become the meat on Yi Muyun's chopping board again. He chose this path, and he had no intention of turning back. Zhou Chongguang didn't let go, and Yi Muyun just watched him in pain, and in the end, His body was simply twitching. Before dying, Yi Muyun reached out and pressed the emergency button. When the doctor was in a hurry, Zhou Chongguang's gaze suddenly turned to Yi Muyun, and there was a trace of a strange smile in his eyes. Yi Muyun sneered. If he couldn't kill him, it would really be difficult. Zhou Chongguang was saved. Yi Muyun carried the bouquet of lilies, threw it into the trash can at the entrance of the hospital, turned around, and left. A slender figure turned around the corner, quietly watched his car leave, and then walked into the hospital. It was Qin Mu. She was wearing an unisex sweater, and her face was covered by a mask, so it was impossible to see her face clearly. A few minutes later, she stood at the entrance of the VIP ward. She looked at Zhou Chongguang lying there lifelessly. Her slender and fair palms were pressed flat against the glass. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she controlled herself and didn't enter the room, nor did she want to disturb him. She watched him for 10 minutes. After making sure he was still alive, she left quietly. Zhou Chongguang, who was lying on the sickbed, suddenly opened his eyes. There was a sharpness in his eyes that he had never seen before, as well as a hint of a cold smile. When Yi Muyun returned to the company, he was surprised to see Cher. He pulled his tie, walked to the sofa, and sat down. He smiled. "Why are you here?" "There's nothing to do at home." Cher leaned on his shoulder. "I want to ask you where you've been." He smiled. "You're here to check on me?" Yeah." She leaned on his shoulder and sniffed around like a puppy, which made him not know whether to laugh or cry. He grabbed her long hair and asked, "Do you smell anything, Mrs. Yi?" "It smells like disinfectant." The little girl wrinkled her nose. She was quite good at acting. "Tell me, who did you bring to the hospital to destroy the evidence of your crimes?" Yi Muyun laughed. "What kind of evidence could there be? Tell me." She leaned on his shoulder, bit his ear, and said softly. Yi Muyun looked at her with a peculiar gaze. "Shui, do you want a child?" "I don't." She denied it with a blush and bit his neck. "Mr. Yi, you haven't explained it clearly." Chapter 2084. He asked shamelessly, "But I'm just one woman. Do you think I should tell you in detail?" Shuang-er cried out, saying that he was shameless. But the more she behaved like this, the more he wanted to bully her. He held her little face in his arms, leaned close to her ear, and told her how he wanted her in detail, without skipping any details. The little girl couldn't stand it. Her little face was so red that it was about to bleed, and her ears were red. She wanted to break free, but he could easily control her with a little force. In the end, she couldn't stand it anymore and called him brother in a particularly seductive voice. Yi Muyun's heart suddenly seemed to be full of unspeakable satisfaction. He grabbed her little ear as if he were holding a small animal, and his voice was soft and incredibly gentle. "Baby, you're trying to make me happy, aren't you?" She shook her head and then nodded again. Her stupid look was killing him. After kissing her for a while, he let go of her and got down to business. "After the engagement, you'll accompany Mumu to the United States. It'll be too obvious if my mother goes there. I'll be able to focus my work on New York in about a month." He hugged her tenderly. Cher nodded. "I'll take good care of Mumu." "I believe you." "Cher, I've always thought that you were a child, but now I only trust you." He kissed her forehead. "You can't make it clear. Otherwise, Mumu won't be able to stand it. I think only when we separate will she be more indifferent. Besides, you should organize more parties in the United States." He thought that anyone could be with Mumu, as long as it wasn't Zhou Chongguang, who was like a time bomb. Shuang-er obediently lay in his arms and nodded. I will make Mumu chubby." The brother smiled and pinched her little face. "It would be better if you could make yourself fat." After a pause, he couldn't help but say something ambiguous. "How does Mumu feel?" "That's what her husband needs to worry about in the future, and as he spoke, his palms became a little unruly. Snow, of course, sensed it. She immediately wrapped her arms around his waist and stopped him shamelessly. "Not here." She was still young and couldn't accept it in a place like the office. Yi Muyun looked down at her little face and knew that she couldn't accept it, so he smiled and didn't force her. He just carried her to the lounge, put her on the bed, and leaned over. When I get off work, we'll eat outside. Shui Er grunted in acknowledgement. She suddenly hooked her little arms around his neck. Qin Mu forgets about Zhou Chongguang, how will you deal with him? There was a deep look in Yi Muyun's eyes, but he didn't say anything. He just reached out and rubbed her hair. It was then that Snow realized that he wasn't going to let Zhou Chongguang go. He was probably going to kill him. As for Zhou Chongguang and Mumu, Zhou Chongguang was indeed inhumane. His father had passed away, but it was an accident. Mumu clearly had that disease, but he still provoked him and did that. He really deserved to die. His father had passed away, but it was an accident. Mumu clearly had that disease, but he still provoked him and did that. He really deserved to die. A smile appeared on Cher's fair face and she said softly, no matter what you want to do, don't let Mumu know. Chapter 2085. Yi Muyun stared fixedly at her for a long time. She reached out to rub her hair and said hoarsely, I know. This was the first time he felt that their hearts were connected. This joy was even greater than the first time he had her. At the peak of their passion, he did not say anything and merely hugged her, allowing himself to feel the beating of her little heart. He had never felt this way before. She was his. Baby, thank you for letting me have you. His voice was low and husky as he hugged her. She did not know why he was so emotional all of a sudden. However, a hug without any desire was something no girl would reject. She lay in his embrace obediently until he had to go to work. Cher waited for him to leave before rolling around on the bed twice. It was only then that she felt that she needed a bestie to tell her that she liked someone and that she was in love with someone. That person was her brother whom she had grown up with, but after thinking about it and pulling out a bunch of her hair, she realized that other than Sister Lee, there was no one else she could tell. Cher sat up and crossed her legs. She cleared her throat and said to the air in a serious tone, Auntie Lee, let me tell you something. Even though it's a little surreal, it's true. She started acting seriously. That's right, I think I'm in love with my brother. Don't you find it funny? As she said that, her face fell. Sigh, how can I say that to Sister Lee? That's so embarrassing. She'll definitely say that I'm bored. She won't. She'll be really happy. A man's voice rang out from the door. It was clear and melodious. Snow jumped in fright. She turned around, and then froze in shock. Yi Muyun came in to get something before pinching her little nose. Next time, just say those words to me. Don't scare the elderly. With that said, he chuckled out and walked toward the door. The door closed as Cher covered her face and lay on the bed stiffly. That was way too embarrassing. Outside the door, Yi Muyun's deep laughter could be heard. All the unwillingness and anger that Zhou Chongguang had brought to him had been soothed by this little fool. He got off work very late, but the incident with Rongguang was a fatal blow to his career. It was not until 7 o'clock that he closed his notebook and remembered that there was a little fool in his lounge. Ignoring the fact that Guze was still there, he quickly walked into the lounge and saw that the little person was sleeping soundly on the bed like a white piglet. He couldn't help but laugh. He rubbed his temples and said to Guze behind him, You can get off work first. After a while, he changed his mind. Forget it, wait for me. Guze smiled and guessed what he meant. He went outside to get Mr. Ye's coat and keys and stood guard at the door. Sure enough, after a while, Mr. Yi came out with his piglet in his arms. Guze thoughtfully covered the piglet with his coat. He also had a principle in his heart. Mr. Yi could get sick, but the piglet couldn't. Yi Muyun glanced at Guze and entered the elevator. Later, the car was still driven by Guze. Yi Muyun sat in the back seat and held the little fellow the whole time. The black supercar drove all the way to Pei Garden. Unexpectedly, Pei Garden was brightly lit. Guze hesitated for a moment. Mr. Yi, I won't bother you anymore. He got out of the car, opened the door for Yi Muyun, and then drove away. Chapter 2086. Cher woke up when she got out of the car. She opened her eyes, looked at Yi Muyun, and said in a soft voice, Brother. Yi Muyun lowered his head and pressed it against her forehead. His voice was very soft. Mom and Dad are back. At the beginning, the little girl who had just woken up was a little confused, but after 2 seconds, she immediately struggled to get out of the car and ran towards the hall, but she ran too fast and almost bumped into Sister Lee. Sister Lee patted her chest. Miss, slow down, what if you fall? Cher made a sound and wanted to run again, but her body was held by a big palm, followed by Yi Muyun's laughing voice. Cher, don't you have something to say to Sister Lee? The little girl's little face suddenly turned red, and she felt very guilty. She stammered, No, brother, did you remember wrong? The one who answered her was the serious Mr. Yi. Did you forget that you thought for a long time in the lounge today about what you wanted to tell Sister Lee? The little girl's face turned red. Sister Lee's appetite was also aroused, and she asked in confusion, What do you want to say? The little girl stammered even more. Forgot. How could you forget at such a young age? Sister Lee was very fond of her. Later, Sister Lee will give you more things to nourish your brain. Cher breathed a sigh of relief, but Yi Muyun, who was behind her, said very kindly, Do you want me to remind you what you want to say to Sister Lee? Sister Lee's eyes lit up. Yi Muyun's voice was even lighter. Sister Lee, Xiaoxin regards you as her best friend, and has something to say to you. Sister Lee's eyes were simply shining with green light, staring straight at Cher. Cher felt a lot of pressure. She looked at Yi Muyun sadly. It was all his fault. It was all his fault. Too abominable. Yi Muyun chuckled and whispered into her ear, Sleep in my room tonight. The little girl didn't dare to agree because her daddy and mommy were back. Although they used to sleep together when they were young, now, it was different. While Cher was hesitating, Yi Muyun said, Sister Lee, Cher means. Before he could finish, Cher's voice sounded, I agree. She was afraid that he would say it out loud. Yi Muyun chuckled and held her little hand as they walked into the main house. He turned around and looked at Sister Lee, who was dumbfounded. Cher said your cooking is delicious. Sister Lee was obviously disappointed. This was it. What happened to being best friends? As soon as little Xinshin saw Tang Yu and Pei Chichi, she threw herself at them and affectionately called them Daddy and Mommy. Yi Muyun also greeted Uncle Tang and Auntie Pei politely. After a round of intimacy, little Xinshin was hugged by Pei Chichi to check every bone and every piece of skin. Of course, Pei Chichi naturally saw that there was a strange thing on her daughter's neck. It was a kiss mark. She looked at Yi Muyun quietly without batting an eyelid. There was a faint reproach in her eyes. Can't you wait for a few days? Yi Muyun received her gaze and coughed lightly to show his acknowledgement. Pei Chichi gave Tang Yu a look. As her father, he didn't say anything and invited them to have dinner together. After dinner, Tang Yu said calmly, Cher, you and your mom haven't chatted for a long time. I haven't sparred with Mu Yun for a long time. He looked at Yi Muyun. Aren't you busy with work tomorrow? Chapter 2087. He looked at Yi Muyun. Aren't you busy with work tomorrow? Uncle Tang is in the mood, so I should accompany him. Yi Muyun smiled bitterly in his heart, but on the surface, he put on a decent smile. It was not easy to get Tang Yu's complete trust, but he did it, but the difference of a few days had beaten him back to his original state. He looked at Cher, which was basically a threat. Wait for him in his bedroom tonight, or else he would tell Sister Lee. Xiaoxin looked at him with tears in her eyes. Too bad. Pei Chichi looked at them strangely, not knowing what the two little ones were up to. As for Tang Yu, he couldn't wait to beat up Yi Muyun until his face was swollen. Very soon he arrived at the meditation room first. Yi Muyun also changed his clothes and went over. The moment he went in, a bamboo stick was thrown into his hand, and a fierce move was coming at him. Yi Muyun could only defend himself. He couldn't avoid this beating today, but he just hoped that it wouldn't be too embarrassing. So, after waiting for half an hour and giving face to his future father-in-law, he got beaten up. His back was hit 3 times heavily. Although it didn't break his flesh, his skin swelled up. He didn't dare to look back, but just said softly, again. In the end, he got hit about 7 or 8 times, and his back was almost not his, burning with pain. After beating him up, Tang Yu didn't say anything, but just curled his lips. You're so useless. I'll practice again in the future. He had to act more meticulously so that his future father-in-law would feel good and be satisfied. When Yimuyun left, he went upstairs with his back bent, and with every step he felt like he was going to cough out his lungs. He felt that he had to be hospitalized, but it was too embarrassing. How could he be so weak? Also, he wanted to consummate their marriage tonight. He was really brave. The way he treated himself and Zhou Chongguang was simply double standards. He pushed open the bedroom door, but there was no one there. He didn't have the strength to look for her, so he lay on the bed, panting heavily. After lying there for more than an hour, the door finally creaked open. The door closed and the little girl's soft voice rang out. "Brother, are you asleep?" This was what the young girl was thinking. If he fell asleep, she would leave again. Because she knew that he would definitely want her, and the sound he made would wake up Daddy and Mommy, and then he would probably be beaten by Daddy. But when the little girl walked closer, she discovered that her omnipotent brother had already been beaten up. And he was beaten up so badly. "Brother," she moaned softly, tugging at him. Yimuyun had thought that he had fainted. Now that he had woken up, he opened his eyes and looked at the little girl in front of him. He forced a smile and said, "Cher, help me apply some medicine." As he struggled to move, his kimono fell to the ground. His back was covered in wounds. The little girl covered her mouth, and with a cry, she burst into tears. He was comforted in his heart. She finally knew how to care for him. But the little girl said after a while, "Do you have to change the person for this engagement? Brother, are you going to die?" What happened to the telepathy? He felt his vision go black. The little girl wiped her tears and said, "If it doesn't work, tell me, brother. You must find a substitute, like Zhou Chongguang, and I'll ask Manager Lin to pick someone similar to you." He gritted his teeth. "Tang Cher, are you taking revenge now?" "Ah, you can tell?" The little girl covered her face. "Brother, you're the best." Chapter 2088. But when she applied the medicine, the little girl still felt sad. After applying it, she asked, "Brother, does it hurt?" Yimuyun clenched his teeth and chuckled softly. "How can it hurt? Brother doesn't hurt at all. It really doesn't hurt." Shuang-er poked him lightly with her little finger. "That doesn't hurt? Big brother, did Daddy hit you so hard that you've lost your mind?" This little fool. Yimuyun clenched his teeth, not knowing what to say. "Of course I'm not silly." After he said that, he felt that what he said was quite silly. Cher sucked in a deep breath. "That's right, I know. It hurts." He had been feeling much better, but after she said that, it seemed that he was starting to hurt again. His body hurt, and his head hurt even more. But his heart was full. Actually, what was the pain? Wasn't she by his side? Yimuyun stretched out his finger, clasped the little girl, and pulled her. Cher accidentally lay on his back, pressing on his wound. Yimuyun let out a muffled groan, feeling extremely embarrassed. The little girl was frightened. She moved her little body, not knowing what to do for a long time. But every time she moved, it was like a death by 1,000 cuts to him. In extreme pain, Yimuyun secretly sighed in his heart. "She was sent by God to take care of me." Cher turned over with great difficulty and lay down beside him. Her little face was wrinkled as if she was about to cry. "Brother?" The wise and mighty Mr. Yi lay down and looked at his little girl. After a while, he coughed softly. "Do you know why your daddy hit me?" The little girl buried her little face in the bedsheets, and after a while, she said vaguely, Because we live together." The injured Mr. Yi sneered and raised his hand to pinch her soft little face. "You're not stupid." The little girl looked at him pitifully. After a long time, she pulled his arm and apologized in a low voice. "Brother, it's my fault. I seduced you." Mr. Yi sighed in his heart. "This little fool, how could it be your fault? If I didn't have such thoughts, no matter what you did, I wouldn't have had those thoughts." However, his face was still serious as he coughed lightly. "Then how are you going to compensate me?" Xiaoxin was still eager. She bit her little finger and looked at him. He looked at her little face and couldn't help but put his finger over for her to bite. The little girl whimpered pitifully, not daring to spit it out. With one hand, he pulled her closer to his chest and said in a low voice, "You promised to sleep in my room. Now that I can't move, what should I do?" Being bullied like this, the little girl's eyes were filled with pitiful tears. After a long time, she spat out a few words, "I'll move." After that, she very attentively said, "Big brother, quickly lie down." Yi Muyun gritted his teeth. "Do you think I can lie down now?" The little girl wanted to cry again. Her sniffling was actually a little playful, probably because she knew that he liked it. In the end, she still wanted to make him happy, so she thought of a way and crawled over. Yi Muyun was also stunned. He never thought that one day she would do this for him. God, she was still so young. Chapter 2089. The little girl sniffled as she replied to him, from the manga. Then all of his self-control collapsed. In the end, he was so embarrassed that he lay on his side and looked at his girl. His voice was soft. "Shinshin, you've learned to be bad." He was injured, so she had to do the cleaning. After that, she lay on her stomach and pretended to be dead. Yi Muyun was a person who loved cleanliness, and she cleaned up in a mess. In the end, he endured the pain and went to wash himself. Looking at himself in the mirror, Yi Muyun chuckled. He was so embarrassed, but he was so happy. He dragged himself back to the bedroom. The little girl was already asleep. She was lying on her stomach with saliva dripping from the corner of her mouth. Yi Muyun shook his head and smiled. He covered her with the quilt and lay next to her. Actually, his body was not satisfied. He felt very uncomfortable when she messed around just now. But now, looking at her like this, his heart calmed down. Lying next to her and looking at her little face, he felt like he was holding her hand and growing old with her. All the troubles seemed to have been blown away. Mr. Yi was Mr. Yi. After a beating, he was full of energy again the next day. When they went downstairs for breakfast, Tang Yu glanced at him indifferently, expressing his satisfaction. His body was great. Yi Muyun nodded politely. "Uncle Tang, Auntie Pei." Tang Yu nodded lightly, while Pei Chi smiled. "After the engagement, you can call me Mom and Dad. Just call me Mom and Dad from now on." She looked at Tang Yu. "Are you Tang Yu?" Tang Yu reached out to her. "Come here." He pulled Pei Chi onto his lap and fed her breakfast. Yi Muyun looked at them and thought that half of the reason why he was able to enter the Tang family was because of Tang Yu's love for his wife. Thinking about the reason why Tang Yu had given him the power so early, he sighed. What's more, he wanted to have a child with Cher now, so that he and Cher could travel around the world when they were still young. The company would be left to their son. However, he could only think about it. Cher was so young, and he didn't want her to have a child so early. Tang Yu looked at Yi Muyun and asked, "Where's Cher?" "She's still sleeping," Yi Muyun said with a hint of gentleness. Tang Yu didn't ask further. After breakfast, Pei Chi and Yi Muyun talked about the engagement. Pei Chi was a woman after all, and she had her own thoughts. Yi Muyun sighed in his heart. His little girl wasn't as attentive as his mother-in-law. She was still a child. After discussing with him, Pei Chi smiled. "Let's invite Anlin and Liang Qiu to dinner tonight. We haven't seen each other for a long time." Although it was a meeting between acquaintances, Yi Muyun knew that this was a formal marriage proposal. Of course, it was up to the groom. "I'll arrange it." Yi Muyun thought for a moment. "Let's set it at Wenhua Hotel. I'll ask the driver to pick you up at 6 p.m. Tang Yu and Pei Chi were very satisfied with him. This child grew up in the Tang family, but he was basically left to fend for himself. He even took care of Cher. As his parents, they reflected on themselves. In fact, they were the ones who took advantage of the Qin family. This family dinner was very well arranged by Yi Muyun. The parents of both sides also attached great importance to it, especially the two madams, who were dressed quite grandly. Chapter 2090. On the other hand, Cher was the only one who wore a jumper and a pair of skinny jeans. Her hair was tied up in a bun, and she came over simply. The adults all shook their heads and didn't agree, because Muyun's posture was straight and upright. Even the two little ones, Qin Mo and Qin Mu, were wearing formal attire. Wasn't this bride-to-be a little too casual? When Cher came in, she also found that the scene seemed to be a little big. Didn't they say that they were going to have a meal with their family? Why was everyone so grand? Yi Muyun smiled. She probably doesn't know. No matter how stupid Cher was, she understood what was going on. She gave him a reproachful look and whispered, "Why didn't you say so earlier?" "It's my fault." He held her little hand, rubbed it gently, and pulled her to sit down with him. The table was full of adults. Almost all of them were talking to Yi Liangqiu and Pei Chichi. Yi Muyun would occasionally reply with a smile and was polite all the time. As time went by, Cher, who originally didn't have anything to say, became a little shy. It was clearly a meal, but it gave her a feeling that she was proposing a marriage. Okay, the little girl finally understood. Yi Liangqiu took out a gilded booklet with a long list of gifts on it. The daughter-in-law of the Qin family naturally couldn't be shabby. At the top was a manor-style villa named Qin Garden, which was for the young couple to live in after the engagement. There was also a list of movable and immovable property behind it, which was dazzling. Pei Chichi thought for a while, took out a small part of it and returned the rest. Then she also took out a booklet which was also a long list of dowries. The Tang family couldn't be careless when marrying off a daughter. Both sides were very happy, and just like that, they settled down. The atmosphere was still a little subtle. After all, it was a big matter, and both sides had to give face to each other. Only a little heart could keep eating and eating until its stomach was full. Pei Chichi looked at her daughter several times, but she was still eating. Yi Muyun gave his mother-in-law a comforting look to show his indulgence. Therefore, everyone was at ease and did not ask for more. As long as Muyun liked it. Just as the atmosphere was harmonious, the door to the private room opened. The person who came in was not a waiter, but an unexpected person, Zhou Chengguang. His body was covered in gauze, and so was his face. He struggled to get in. Behind him was the exasperated manager. "You can't go in." But the door was already open. The atmosphere suddenly changed. The manager's voice trembled a little. "Mr. Qin, Mr. Tang, I'm sorry. We'll ask the security guards to come over." Yi Muyun's voice was very soft. "Hurry up and go." "There's no need for security," Zhou Chengguang said calmly. "I think it's the same even if Mr. Yi does it himself." As soon as he said that, everyone looked at Yi Muyun. Qin Anlin's old face was a little dark. He coughed lightly and said, "I was the one who hit him. It has nothing to do with Muyun." His son was just about to get engaged. He couldn't let the other party think that his son was so violent. Besides, he was the one who hit him. Qin Mu couldn't help standing up and said in a trembling voice, "Dad?" Qin Anlin's expression became serious. "Mu, you should know why I hit him." Qin Mu pursed her lips. "It's not his fault. It's me, who likes him." Qin Anlin was angry, but in the end, he couldn't bear to expose Zhou Chengguang's plot. If that happened, Mu would not be able to bear it. Chapter 2091. Why? Qin Mu's voice was a little choked with sobs. "He can wait for me to grow up." Qin Anlin still had to give his daughter some face. His face was gloomy, but he still restrained himself. "If you have anything to say, let's talk about it tomorrow. Today is the day of your brother's engagement." Zhou Chengguang suddenly said, "Today, I also want to propose to Mumu. I hope Uncle Qin agrees." Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. Was this kid deliberately going against him? Yi Muyun looked at Zhou Chengguang. "If you want to marry Qin Mu, we will respect her choice in 4 years." Zhou Chengguang looked straight at Qin Mu. "What about you?" Qin Mu was already standing. Then she slowly walked toward Zhou Chengguang. Cher called out, "Qin Mu." Qin Mu turned around and looked at her. She smiled weakly and said, "Cher, I tried my best, but I couldn't convince myself to give up." She said softly, "I watched him play the piano for 2 years." No one knew that the reason why she could recover was because of Zhou Chengguang's playing of the piano. She was not infatuated with him, but dependent on him. She had long been unable to give up what she relied on for survival. Qin Mu's words were a great blow to Cher. She had always thought that Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang had known each other for at most 1 or 2 months. She did not expect that it would be 2 years. Zhou Chongguang might not have done anything in the past 2 years, but all of this was Muumu's deliberate plan. He had turned passive into active, and everything was very difficult. Both the Qin and Tang families were shocked by Qin Mu's words. Only Zhou Chongguang smiled faintly and said, "Muumu, are you willing to be with me?" Qin Mu smiled slightly, and there was a hint of determination in her eyes. Things that he had been relying on for a long time were like drugs. It was impossible to quit. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very light. "Mr. Zhou, I believe in your feelings for Muumu, and I believe in my silly daughter's stubbornness, but she is not yet of legal age. It's reasonable for her father to beat you up." Zhou Chongguang did not refute. Yi Liangqiu continued, "Mu Yun is right. We won't stop him after 4 years. Also, don't use Mu Yun and Cher as an example. You two are different. As for what's different, you should know very well." Zhou Chongguang lowered his eyes. "Yes." He looked up. "I got it." He just glanced at Qin Mu, smiled faintly, turned around and walked out. He didn't make any more trouble, but the shadow he left was left in everyone's heart, especially Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu. They knew their daughter's mind so well. They also knew how terrible it would be if the disease relapsed. Qin Mu stood there for a long time before she said, "I know my brother wants me to go to the United States. I'll go, but don't make things difficult for him." She was young, but she was more mature than Cher. She turned around, looked at her parents, and apologized bitterly. Who could blame a little girl who had been sick? At that time, she was so sick that only bones were left. Everyone had seen her. She was so fragile that she could leave them at any time. No one dared to take the risk. And Qin Mu's life could only be twisted again and again until she woke up. When she woke up, she felt that she had missed so much because of Zhou Chongguang. Chapter 2092. At that time, Zhou Chongguang was complacent, and she had been raised by him at home. To be honest, he was not mean to her. It was just that she looked at him and one day suddenly found that the person she loved had disappeared. He had not played for Alice, whom she depended on for survival, for several years. Epilogue. At this time, Qin Mu looked at the closed door and tears fell. No one had the heart to blame her, not even a harsh word. All of this was just an ill-fated relationship. That night, Yi Muyun and Cher stayed in the Qin's mansion. Although it was an important day, Yi Muyun did not pester his little wife. Instead, he patted her hand and said, "I'm sorry to trouble you today." Cher half knelt in front of him and kissed the corner of his mouth. "Speaking of which, I provoked Zhou Chongguang." Yi Muyun sighed. "I was the one who drove him to the last." If Zhou Chongguang had never liked Cher, he could have agreed to this marriage, which was full of evil intentions. He could even persuade his parents to agree to it. He could offer very generous conditions to let Zhou Chongguang treat Muumu well, as if he had bought a senior servant. However, his relationship with Cher would hurt Muumu sooner or later. In this world, there was no impenetrable wall. In 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, Muumu would hear about Zhou Chongguang, Cher, and him sooner or later. At that time, could she bear such a blow? It was very embarrassing for Muumu to become a family. Her husband liked her sister-in-law. Yi Muyun was very distressed. He smoked a cigarette in front of Cher and patted her little face. "Go and see Muumu for me. You are about the same age. It may be easier for her to tell you the truth." Hearing that, Cher sighed. She didn't tell me that she had listened to Zhou Chongguang play for 2 years. Yi Muyun let out the long sigh. "Coax her and agree to let her be with Zhou Chongguang. But I'm going to New York next week." Cher nodded. She also had a vague feeling that Muumu was not the only one that Zhou Chongguang would not let go of. And her. At this time, Zhou Chongguang was like an angel of revenge. He could do anything. He seemed to have no scruples. Snow suddenly stopped in her tracks and turned her head to the side. Should have relatives too, right? Yi Muyun looked at her. He probably knew what she meant. He was a little surprised. Cher wasn't usually so ruthless. She must have been forced into a corner. He shook his head. This time, Zhou Chongguang has thrown himself into a dead end. It's useless to threaten him with anything. Cher didn't say anything, nor did she leave immediately. Instead, she looked at Yi Muyun quietly. After a while, she suddenly walked back and reached out to hug his waist. She hugged him with all her might and buried her little face in his arms. "Brother, don't worry too much. Mumu will be fine." He held her waist, lowered his head and kissed her for a while. Then he said in a hoarse voice, "Cher, I'm very happy to have met you when I was 7 years old. Life was so short, and he was lucky enough to have loved her for so long." She obediently nestled in his arms. "Me too." The two of them hugged each other, and it was indescribably beautiful, but it was also a prelude to the storm. Cher went to see Qin Mu and came back after about 2 hours. Yi Muyun was leaning against the bed and smoking. It seemed that he had smoked half a pack. Chapter 2093. How is she? Yi Muyun watched her little body crawl over and automatically nestle in his arms. Her little body was a little cold. When she met him, she sighed comfortably. Yi Muyun put her little hands and feet in his arms and kissed her little mouth. Cher looked up and said, "She's quite calm." After a pause, she continued, "But I'm really worried. The calmer Mumu is, the more worried I am." Yi Muyun's voice was a little firm. "No matter what, we will never hand Mumu over to Zhou Chongguang now." Cher felt even more uneasy. She was not stupid. She was not stupid. She could tell that between Mumu and her, he had chosen her, not Mumu. In fact, she knew that there was another way. That was, if she left him, then there would be no problem for Qin Mu and Zhou Chongguang to be together. However, no one said that. Mumu was like a patient with a terminal illness. There was a glimmer of hope, but the price was too high. No one mentioned it, and no one asked her to sacrifice herself. She herself did not dare to say it out loud. If she said it out loud, it would set off a bloodbath that was even greater than the matter between Zhou Chongguang and Mumu. It was destined to be a sleepless night. She was, and so was he. She knew that he had gotten up in the middle of the night to smoke a few cigarettes outside. She did not know if he had considered this method, but when he came back, he did not say anything and just hugged her tightly. At that time, Cher thought that her brother was actually very pitiful. On one side was his sister, and on the other side was his relationship with her for more than 10 years. He must be feeling very uncomfortable. She stayed by his side obediently and accompanied Qin Mu. Qin Mu attended the engagement ceremony between her and Yi Muyun. The little pianist also came, but Qin Mu said that he was very ugly, and Zhou Chongguang also came. His injuries had already healed. Dressed in a black suit, he looked very handsome, but his expression was no longer the same as before. Cher saw the light in Qin Mu's eyes. It was the light of a girl in love. Cher thought that if Zhou Chongguang didn't say anything for the rest of his life and treated Mumu well for the rest of his life, it would be good for Mumu to be so happy all the time. At her engagement ceremony, she actually had such thoughts. "Mrs. Yi, focus." Yi Muyun hugged her and kissed her forehead. "You looked at Zhou Chongguang for more than 10 seconds? Today, she was dressed in a white wedding gown. There was a diamond tiara on her forehead. It was custom-made by an Italian designer and was worth a few $100 million. It was his engagement gift for her. Today, she was indescribably beautiful. He's not as handsome as Big Brother," the little girl said in a soft voice. She lay on his shoulder and danced with him. Her eyes, however, were still fixated on Qin Mu, looking at how happy she was. Would Qin Mu still be so happy after going to New York? Cher didn't know, but everyone had decided to let Qin Mu take the risk, and she was no exception. The engagement ceremony was grand and lively, but she was absent-minded the whole time. She thought that her brother was the same. Otherwise, He wouldn't have let her be absent-minded for so long on the night of the engagement ceremony. He chose to spend it in the presidential suite. Cher was carried by him and slowly walked out of the elevator. She put her little hands around his neck and pouted. What's the surprise? Chapter 2094. Cher looked at him and smiled coquettishly. What is it? Why are you being so secretive? Yi Muyun kissed the corner of her mouth. You can look forward to it. Cher hugged his neck tightly. He carried her with one arm and opened the door to the suite with the other. She let out a small scream the moment the door opened. The lights in the gorgeous suite were not turned on. Only the ceiling was decorated with countless little stars, warming up the dark night. The starlight paved the way, and he carried her inside. Black roses were placed randomly at their feet, making the night even wilder. They walked all the way to the bedroom. There was a huge heart-shaped cake on the French bed. The candlelight was already lit and there were two little people dancing on the cake. Cher looked at it and then looked at Yi Muyun with a shy look on her little face. He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth. He asked hoarsely, "Baby, do you like it?" She made a sound of agreement and tried to hug his neck. She turned her head sideways to look at the dancing flame with him. His forehead pressed against hers, and a ring appeared in his hand, slipping into her fingertip. "Happy birthday," he murmured. The engagement ring was given to Cher by Yi Muyun, but this is my gift to Xiaoxin. With that, he chuckled, "Little yellow bun." He threw her and danced in the candlelight. As he danced, he bit on his little yellow bun to his heart's content. Cher's bare feet stepped on his instep. There was no way for her to escape. She could only hug him tightly so that he could not bite her. The two of them messed around and fell onto the soft carpet together. He pressed her thin shoulders and kissed her gently. He ate her in small bites. Cher's eyes were like water. She reached out and lifted her body so that he could kiss her more deeply. The candlelight flickered and cast a pair of shadows on the wall. That night, they were in a frenzy. When Cher woke up at dawn, she was sleeping on the sofa. To be precise, she was sleeping in Yi Muyun's arms. He was 184 and she was only 162, so she looked very small in his arms. She opened her eyes and looked at his sleeping handsome face. Under the morning light, he looked especially young and handsome. She reached out her smooth little arm and gently touched the faint bruise on his chin. It was a little prickly. Just like that, she gently touched him and giggled, but he didn't wake up. Later, she mischievously leaned against his ear and screamed, "Brother, get up." He did not open his eyes, but he quickly grabbed her arm and pulled her into his embrace. His voice was clear and hoarse. "Shui, sleep a little longer. I'm exhausted." Last night was crazy. He was almost exhausted, but this little guy was still so energetic. Mr. Yi reflected on himself in his heart. Did he go too easy on her? So he opened his eyes, looked at his little fellow and smiled. "Still want?" Cher widened her eyes and shook her head vigorously. Of course not. However, he had already pulled her into his arms and said in a seductive voice, "I'll feed you more." Cher screamed, but her mouth was covered again. Then she fell into his arms. When she woke up again, it was already afternoon. When she opened her eyes, she was lying on the bed. The moment she opened her mouth, it was indescribably soft and a little hoarse. "Brother." Yi Muyun stood by the bed. The moment she woke up, he bit her little face. "You're awake." Chapter 2095. She moved her body and felt that there was nothing under the wool blanket. She looked up at him and said, "Brother, I'll help you get dressed and take you out to play, okay?" He smiled, took the neatly folded clothes from the side and began to help her get dressed. Cher curled up like a shrimp and her whole body was faintly red. She looked at him and said, "Brother, don't you need to go to work? I still have time to play with you for a day." He smiled gently and held her in his arms, kissing her while putting on the clothes. It was so sticky that Cher couldn't stand it. What happened to her brother's coldness? "Mr. Yi, when have I ever been cold in front of you?" After putting on the clothes, he patted her and said, "Go brush your teeth. I'll take you out after dinner." Cher looked at his clothes as she ran. They were similar to her in casual British style. He was very handsome. She made a face at him. "It'll be done in a while." When they sat together for dinner, she found that he hadn't eaten either. Her mouth was full. "Brother, why don't you eat first?" He didn't answer her but said lightly, "Do you still call me brother?" "I like to call you brother." The little girl wasn't afraid of him at all now. She raised her head and winked at him. He smiled and didn't say anything. He just took care of her needs and prepared food for her from time to time. "Do you like me?" he suddenly asked. Cher whimpered, "Brother, you're so annoying." He thought that she was indeed not afraid of him at all. This was good. After dinner, Cher's stomach was rolling and she didn't want to go out. In the end, he dragged her out. Both of them were wearing navy windbreakers. They walked together, obviously a couple's outfit. He held Cher's hand in his and she felt that he was caring for her. Moreover, she wasn't used to walking on the street like this, so she walked aimlessly. "Brother, where are we going?" she asked in a low voice. Yi Muyun tilted his head and smiled. "Just walking around. Don't you like to go out and play?" He pinched her little face. "Where do you want to go?" "A movie, a snack, a ride on the merry-go-round," she said, smiling sweetly at him. He agreed and carried her on his back. He thought, I only have this kind of person, so what if I spoil him a little? She followed him at such a young age, so he should treat her better. From the afternoon until nightfall, they adapted to their new identities. In the crowd, he held her hand and said softly, "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Yi." Her crescent moon-like eyes were filled with stars. "You too, Mr. Yi." He kissed her in the crowd, kissing the only love in his life. After a long time, he let go of her, held her little hand, and walked forward. Compared to the sweetness between Yi Muyun and Cher, the atmosphere in the Pei residence was gloomy. Yi Liangqiu was holding a medicine bottle in her hand. Her fingers were trembling and she could hardly hold it. "Anlin, Mumu is taking medicine." Qin Anlin reached out to take it. After looking at it for a long time, he opened it and counted the number of pills. "She has been taking it for days." Qin Anlin's voice was a little sad. "Liangqiu, we can't send Mumu abroad at this time." He closed his eyes. She has realized that there is something wrong with her. Chapter 2096. She could not forget the scene from a few years ago. Sometimes she would even have nightmares. She dreamed that Mumu left them. Now her illness had relapsed. How could she not tremble? Yi Liangqiu almost did not even have the courage to ask Qin Mu, but she knew that Mumu needed treatment. Not only physically, but also psychologically. "Liangqiu, I was too impulsive." Qin Anlin's voice was a little cold. After a long time, he continued, "I'll talk to Mum." Yi Liangqiu's fingers grabbed his arms so tightly that they almost sank into the flesh of Qin Anlin's arm. "Don't tell Mumu that Zhou Chongguang likes Cher." Her voice was sharp and almost hysterical. Qin Anlin held her hand and smiled comfortingly. "Don't worry. I know what I'm doing." At this time, Qin Mu was like a frightened bird. She could not listen to any stimulating words. Qin Anlin just wanted to persuade her to cooperate with the doctor's treatment. As for the rest, he was willing to help her. It was like a patient with a serious illness. He knew that stopping the pain would not cure the root cause, but he would still use it. He thought that now Zhou Chongguang was Qin Mu's painkiller. Before Qin Anlin went upstairs, he called his secretary and asked him to help him make an appointment with Zhou Chongguang. He did not want Mu Yun to intervene in this matter. After all, Cher was in the way. After hanging up the phone, he walked upstairs. On the way, he looked at Liangqiu, who was sitting on the sofa. Liangqiu was still sitting, and her fingers were still trembling. "Liangqiu, you'll be fine." Qin Anlin's voice was low and hoarse. "As long as I'm here, you'll be fine." Yi Liangqiu's lips moved, and in the end, he squeezed out a smile. However, that smile was trembling. Qin Anlin paused for a moment and then walked upstairs firmly. Before dinner, Qin Mu was lying on the bed in the bedroom with a sketchbook in her hand. Seeing Qin Anlin come in, she naturally put it under the pillow and called Qin Anlin, "Dad?" Qin Anlin sat down slowly and reached out to rub her hair. "What are you looking at?" Qin Mu shook her head. "You're drawing Zhou Chongguang?" Qin Anlin asked with a smile. There were some fine lines between his brows. Qin Mu took it out carefully and said in a low voice, "Yes?" Qin Anlin calmly flipped through the pages and asked in a seemingly casual manner, "You like him a lot?" Qin Mu nodded, "Yes." "Do you have to marry him?" Qin Anlin touched his daughter's head again. "But you're still so young. You don't have to make a decision in a hurry, do you?" Qin Mu nodded and leaned on Qin Anlin's shoulder. She was so obedient, but she didn't know how worried her mother was. So was he. Qin Anlin wasn't afraid, but he had to be calm. Otherwise, Liang Qiu would be afraid, and Qin Mu would be even more afraid. After hesitating for a moment, he took out the medicine and said softly, "Mumu, why did you take this medicine again?" A year ago, she had stopped taking the medicine. The doctor said that she was in good condition and that she didn't need to take the medicine. But now, it was obvious that she had secretly taken it. Qin Mu looked at the medicine bottle and silently took it. After a long time, she nodded and said, "I can't sleep." "When did it start?" Qin Anlin pulled his little daughter into his arms and stroked her hair lovingly. Qin Mu pursed her lips and lowered her eyes. "Half a month ago." He counted the time. How could he not know? Chapter 2097. Perhaps Qin Mu was more sensitive than them. Perhaps she knew something, but she couldn't say it out loud. And as her father, he couldn't tear open her wound with his own hands. He just touched her little head and asked her softly, "Mumu, are you willing to see a psychiatrist? Do you know Dr. Zhang Mingyuan?" Zhang Mingyuan was very young, only in his early 20s. He used to be the assistant of Mumu's attending doctor, and now he was an authoritative psychiatrist. Moreover, the famous clinic was also opened by the Zhang family, and he had some friendship with Qin Anlin. Mumu didn't need to worry about his privacy being leaked when he went there. Qin Mu raised his eyes and looked at his father. He was very calm, but she could see his anxiety. Qin Mu hugged Qin Anlin and buried herself in his arms. She asked in a low voice, "Dad, is Mom very worried?" "Yes, your mom is very worried. She's about to cry. Do you want to comfort her?" Qin Anlin's voice was low and hoarse, and there was a trace of helplessness in it. Qin Mu grunted in acknowledgement. Qin Anlin took her away. There were tears in Yi Liangqiu's eyes, which had not dried yet. Qin Mu threw herself into her arms and cried, "Mom, I'm very scared." She was also a child, and she also knew what it meant at the beginning. If she didn't get better, she would slowly become depressed, slowly become serious, and become the same as a few years ago. She didn't want that. She was very scared, but she didn't dare to say it. She was afraid to see her parents' sad faces. When she opened her eyes a few years ago, she could hardly recognize her beautiful mother. "It's going to be fine, Mumu." Yi Liangqiu hugged her slender body and kept comforting her. From beginning to end, Qin Mu didn't mention a word about Zhou Chongguang, but they all knew that Zhou Chongguang was her worry. Qin Anlin canceled Qin Mu's plan to go to New York. When Gu Zhe came to tell Yi Myun, he guessed something. That day, he stood in his office for a long time and smoked 2 packs of cigarettes. After work, he didn't go home, nor did he go back to Pei Yuan. Instead, he called Qin Anlin and asked him to meet outside. There were some things that he didn't want to say in front of his mother and Mumu. The place was a private room in a club. When Qin Anlin entered, Yi Myun had already drunk half a bottle of wine. Although he was in a bad mood, Qin Anlin still patted his son on the shoulder and teased him. Mu Yun, you didn't use to drink." Yi Myun smiled and smoked. I'm Myun. I'm Yi Myun." Qin Anlin sat opposite him, and Yi Myun poured him a glass of wine. Qin Anlin drank it in one gulp, then said coldly, "Did you know? That brat Zhou Chongguang disappeared." Yi Myun was silent for a while and then asked softly, Dad, did something happen to Mumu? Qin Anlin shook his head. He secretly took medicine again. Let me deal with it. It's not that Zhou Chongguang didn't disappear, but he found a reasonable way to disappear. Don't forget that he's recuperating now. Yi Muyun's veins were bulging. He knew his parents' choice, and he couldn't blame them. But Zhou Chongguang was really ruthless. Qin Mu, to be honest, was also a little beauty with a calm temperament. But was Zhou Chongguang just using her? Right now, Zhou Chongguang was gambling that he, Yi Muyun, would back down. Chapter 2098. He knew that Zhou Chongguang wanted him to lose his most precious thing as revenge, and share was his most precious thing. That was why Qin Anlin didn't want him to intervene in this matter and chose to talk to Zhou Chongguang himself. Zhou Chongguang's disappearance had shown his attitude. The person he wanted to talk about was either Xuan or him, Yi Muyun. I'll find him. Yi Muyun put out the cigarette in his hand and looked up. There was a deep look in his eyes. Dad, I was careless. Qin Anlin patted him on the shoulder. Not you. When I was young, I used the same tricks. Your Uncle Tang wasn't much gentler. Business is business. There are many cases of families being ruined. It's just that I hit a nail in the head. Zhou Chongguang was a born schemer and gave people a headache. The two of them only sat for a while before they left. Yi Muyun sat in the car and called Cher. He told her that he would stay at the Pei residence tonight. Cher nodded and didn't ask further. After he hung up, he called Gu Zhe. He wanted to find out where Zhou Chongguang was. He sat in the car with the window open and held the cigarette in his hand for a long time until Gu Zhe called. Mr. Yi, Zhou Chongguang is now in a nursing home in a small city in the south. Gu Zhe asked softly. Do you need a private jet? Yi Muyun threw away the cigarette in his hand. We'll take off in half an hour. As he spoke, he stepped on the accelerator and turned the steering wheel in the direction of the airport. That night, Yi Muyun appeared in the nursing home. Zhou Chongguang was still awake. He sat in the courtyard and smoked. When he saw Yi Muyun and his 4 bodyguards, his expression didn't change at all. He just smiled faintly. You found him? Yi Muyun stood there, looking at Zhou Chongguang in the dark. It was a very cold night. Zhou Chongguang was only wearing a black shirt, but his face was clear. No wonder Mumu was so devoted to him. Mr. Yi, my conditions have changed. I don't want King Entertainment's shares. Marrying Qin Mu is like having a death exemption gold medal. Zhou Chongguang chuckled. However, Mr. Yi might suffer some losses. They've just gotten engaged, so they'll probably have to separate. Who gave you that confidence? Yi Muyun's tone was especially cold. He raised his hand, and a few people immediately came up from behind and held Zhou Chongguang down. Zhou Chongguang's expression was somewhat indifferent. Are you going to do it yourself this time? Kill me in the end. But I think if I die, your precious sister will probably follow me. It's worth it. Zhou Chongguang's head was pressed against the bluestone slab. It was a little twisted and deformed, but it didn't affect his performance at all. Yi Muyun stepped forward and stepped hard on his head. Let's see whether Qin Mu can't wait or whether your life can't wait. He took out a gun, took out the clip, put a bullet in and spun it a few times. Zhou Chongguang's face was a little pale. He had guessed what he wanted to do. Let's play a game. If you can't survive these 5 shots, then my sister will die with you. Yi Muyun's voice was cold. Then he pressed the pistol against Zhou Chongguang's temple. We can start counting now. 1. The gun in his hand made a bang, but it was the sound of an empty bullet. It was empty. Chapter 2099. Zhou Chongguang's eyes looked particularly clear under the moonlight. It was the ambition that Yi Muyun was familiar with. Yi Muyun looked into his eyes, pursed his lips, and then fired the second shot. It was another blank bullet. Zhou Chongguang's forehead was covered in sweat, but he did not beg for mercy. If he begged for mercy, he would lose. What he wanted was to gamble with his life. There was a cruel sneer on Yi Muyun's lips. He fired one shot after another, but he missed 5 times. He didn't fire the 6th time. When he threw Zhou Chongguang down, Zhou Chongguang's shirt was covered in cold sweat. He sat on the big blue stone behind him and looked at Yi Muyun with a sneer. "Mr. Yi, are you in pain now?" He smiled mockingly. "Unfortunately, I've been in pain before." Yi Muyun looked down at him. "I'll give you 2 choices. Marry her or stay away from her. You want me to find a perfect reason to leave your sister? Are you afraid that she will be hurt?" Zhou Chongguang smiled softly. No matter how embarrassed he was still smiling. "Yi Muyun, I also said that you only have 2 choices. One is your baby sister, and the other is Tang Sher." He pushed away the person who was suppressing him, stood up unsteadily, and looked at Yi Muyun with a cold expression. "I won't change my mind, or you can kill me. Do you think I don't dare?" Yi Muyun raised the gun and pointed it at Zhou Chongguang. "I've said that I want you to die with Mumu." Zhou Chongguang covered his aching heart, slowly stood up, and smiled faintly. "Shoo." Yi Muyun's fingers pressed down slightly, and a shrill voice came from the other side. "Mu Yun, don't." Yi Liangqiu stumbled over, followed by Cher and Guzei. Yi Muyun had never seen his mother in such a sorry state. He was a little stunned, but he didn't put down the gun in his hand. "Mu Yun, you can't kill him." Yi Liangqiu held Yi Muyun's arm desperately and said in a trembling voice, "Mom, please, don't kill him." Yi Muyun's voice was cold. After a while, he slowly said, "What happened?" Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. "Mumu committed suicide." Yi Muyun's body stiffened, and all the blood in his body seemed to freeze. "How long has it been? Has Mumu's illness become so serious?" He couldn't believe it, and he didn't want to believe it. Moreover, if he were to be cruel now and shoot Zhou Chongguang, he would be buried with Mumu. He couldn't do it, at least not in front of his mother. "Mu Yun, I beg you." Yi Liangqiu sobbed. She had never been so fragile. "Mumu can't be hurt." Yi Muyun looked at his mother quietly for a long time. His voice was even a little cold. "Do you know Zhou Chongguang's request?" Yi Liangqiu looked at her son. She also knew that Mu Yun had always been calm. Otherwise, he would not be so angry now. Yi Muyun looked at Cher, pursed his lips, and said slowly, "Mom, why did you bring Cher here? Have you already made a decision in your heart? Have you decided to sacrifice her?" Yi Liangqiu shook her head. "No, no," but this no sounded so weak, so guilty. Yi Muyun's eyes were as calm as water. He looked at Cher and asked, "What about you?" Cher's face was pale, and she couldn't say a word. Chapter 2100. Yi Muyun looked at his mother again. "Mom, I'm engaged to her, and I've slept with her. How could they split this?" Moreover, he had never treated Cher out of responsibility, but out of love. Between Mumu and Cher, he was more willing to choose Cher. She was innocent, and he would not ask Shuang or to sacrifice her happiness for the sake of his sister. He did not consider himself, but stood in Cher's shoes. For him, no matter what the result was, it would be a lifetime of sin, and there was no redemption. However, he could choose to give his happiness to Shuang, so that she could still be happy by his side. The night wind blew and disturbed everyone's hearts. Yi Muyun's voice was hoarse. "Zhou Chongguang would rather die than force me." "Mom, are you forcing me to make a decision?" Yi Liangqiu almost couldn't stand still. Guzei supported her from the side. After a long time, Yi Liangqiu finally stood up straight. She looked at Zhou Chongguang, pursed her lips, and said softly, "Zhou Chongguang, I can give you all of King Entertainment. I think your anger should be gone. Please let my child go, okay?" Zhou Chongguang's eyes were cold. "Mrs. Qin, do you think everything can be compensated with money?" He spat out a few words coldly. "Don't worry. If Qin Mu dies, your son will kill me and bury me with her." In the night wind, Yi Liangqiu's no was very sad. Snow had been standing there the entire time, watching everything unfold. She was not a fool. Mumu was Auntie Ye's daughter. Between parting and life and death were naturally more important. If she were Auntie Yi, she would also choose to let Mumu live. Under the moonlight, her tears flowed down, but she did not feel it at all. She smiled softly, a little absent-minded. She looked at Yi Muyun and called out, "Big brother?" That call was like a dream, an illusion, and a shadow. Yi Muyun looked back at her. Their eyes met, and they stared at each other for a long time. After a long time, when his eyes were sore, she said softly, "I'm going to America next week." Yi Muyun's body shook, and his voice was hoarse. "Cher, what did you say?" Cher lowered her eyes and said softly, "Zhou Chongguang, I hope you can fulfill your promise." She paused for a moment. "You take revenge on others, and one day, you'll be taken revenge on." As she spoke, she lifted her little face and let out a bright and beautiful smile. She walked towards Yi Muyun and hugged him tightly, as if this was the last time. Actually, this was also the last time. "What is this?" Yi Muyun's voice was cold. "Tang Cher, have you ever asked for my choice?" She hugged him tightly in his arms, and her voice was muffled in his chest. "I know you'll choose to make me happy, but I don't want you to live in guilt for the rest of your life. I'd rather you hate me." She could not want that kind of happiness, and she did not dare to want it. It was too sinful. As she spoke, she slowly withdrew from his arms and wanted to leave. But her little body was caught by him at once, and his hand held her slender arm like a pincer, with a strength that threatened to break it. Cher looked down. "Let go of me. Yi Muyun, I can't like you anymore." She began to struggle desperately. She cried and screamed at him, "Mumu is your sister?" He was still holding her little arm, unwilling to let go. How could he give up on her? You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.